A single question shatters the calm of a London luncheon. Was it murder or suicide? 12 years ago, General Alistair and Margaret Ravenscroft died on a cliffside, a revolver between them, their secrets buried in whispers. Now, Ariadne Oliver, the famed mystery writer, and Hercule Poirot, the master detective, chase memories that refuse to fade. Who was the shadowy twin lurking in the past? Why does a mother's greed stir old wounds? And what truth hides in the fog of memory lane? Music swells, a sharp violin sting. Unravel the mystery in elephants can remember. Memory Lane Murder. Chapter 1. The luncheon intrusion. The autumn sun filtered through the tall windows of the Grand Kensington Hotel, casting golden slants across the damask tablecloths. The dining room buzzed with the clink of crystal and the murmur of London's literary elite gathered for the annual Women Writers' Luncheon. Ariadne Oliver, renowned for her detective novels featuring the Finnish sleuth Sven Hirason, sat at the head table, her silver-streaked hair swept into a loose bun, her eyes sparkling with the mischief of someone who thrived on the absurdities of human nature. She adjusted the peacock feather brooch pinned to her tweed jacket, a nod to her flamboyant streak, and surveyed the room with a writer's keen observation. The luncheon was a ritual of polite chaos authors, critics, and publishers exchanging barbed compliments over plates of poached salmon and cucumber sandwiches. Ariadne, never one for stuffy gatherings, found amusement in the spectacle. She sipped her elderflower cordial, her mind drifting to her latest manuscript, when a shadow bloomed over her table. A woman, broad-shouldered and draped in a garish emerald shawl, stood before her face a mask of determination beneath a heavily powdered complexion. "Mrs. Oliver, I presume," the woman said, her voice carrying the imperious tone of someone put accustomed to being obeyed. "I am Mrs. Eugenia Burton Cox. We have not met, but I have a matter of utmost importance to discuss." Ariadne raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued despite the intrusion. "I'm afraid I'm in the middle of a rather splendid salmon, Mrs. Burton Cox. Perhaps after the speeches—" "No, it cannot wait." Mrs. Burton Cox pulled out a chair uninvited, her shawl swishing like a matador's cape. The other guests, at the table Miss Penelope Havisham, a poetess with a penchant for Gothic verse, and Mr. Clarence Whitby, a publisher with a perpetually damp brow, exchanged glances but said nothing. The air thickened with the promise of drama, and Ariadne, ever the dramatist at heart, leaned forward. "Then do enlighten me," Ariadne said, her tone laced with a playful challenge. "What matter is so urgent it must interrupt my lunch?" Mrs. Burton Cox leaned in, her eyes narrowing. "It concerns a tragedy, Mrs. Oliver, a tragedy from 12 years ago. The Ravenscroft affair. You know of it, I trust." The name struck, a chord, faint but resonant, like a half-forgotten melody. Ariadne's fork paused mid-air. The Ravenscrofts, General Alistair and Margaret Ravenscroft, had died in a shocking incident at their seaside manor in Overcliff. Found dead on a cliffside path, a revolver between them, Their deaths had been the subject of endless speculation. Suicide pact, murder-suicide. The inquest had been inconclusive, and the case had faded into the obscurity of old headlines. Ariadne, who had known Margaret socially through literary circles, felt a pang of sorrow at the memory. "I recall it vaguely," Ariadne said, her voice softening. "A terrible loss. But why bring it up now, and in such a setting?" Mrs. Burton's lips tightened, as if guarding a secret she was loath to share, yet compelled to reveal. "My son, Desmond, is engaged to Celia Ravenscroft, their daughter. I need to know the truth about her parents' deaths. Was it murder, suicide, or something else entirely? I cannot allow my son to marry into a family with such shadows." The audacity of the question landed like a thunderclap. Ariadne's table-mates gasped, and Miss Havisham's monocle nearly fell into her soup. The room's chatter seemed to dim, as if the very walls leaned in to listen. Ariadne set her fork down, her mind racing. This was no idle gossip. Mrs. Burton Cox's demand carried a weight that suggested more than maternal concern. There was a hunger in her eyes, a calculation that unsettled Ariadne's novelist instincts. "That's a rather personal inquiry, Mrs. Burton Cox," Ariadne said, her tone measured but firm. "Celia is my goddaughter, and I assure you she is a young woman of impeccable character. Why does this matter so urgently to you?" Mrs. Burton Cox's fingers toyed with the fringe of her shawl, betraying a flicker of unease. "A mother must protect her son. If there is scandal or worse, danger in Celia's lineage, I have a right to know. You're a detective writer, Mrs. Oliver. You have connections, resources. Surely you can uncover the truth." Ariadne bristled at the implication that her profession was a mere parlor trick, yet the challenge intrigued her. The Ravenscroft case had always nagged at her, a puzzle left unsolved. Margaret had been a vibrant woman, fond of gardening and poetry, while Alistair, a retired general, had exuded quiet strength. Their deaths had seemed incongruous with their lives, and Ariadne's curiosity, dormant for years, stirred anew. "I'm no detective, Mrs. Burton Cox," Ariadne said, her voice cool but her eyes alight with interest. "I weave stories, not solutions. But I'll consider your requests out of respect for Celia, not your insistence." Mrs. Burton Cox's mouth twitched, as if unsure whether to be grateful or affronted. "Very well. I expect discretion, Mrs. Oliver, and results." With that, she rose, her shawl billowing, and swept away, leaving a trail of murmurs in her wake. Miss Havisham leaned forward, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "What a ghastly woman! Do you think there's truth to her fears, Ariadne? A murder in the family?" Ariadne smiled wryly. "Truth, Penelope, is like a good plot twisted, hides in plain sight until you know where to look. I'll need a better sleuth than myself for this one." The luncheon resumed, but Ariadne's thoughts were elsewhere. As the speeches droned on Mr. Whitby pontificating about the future of the printed word, she slipped away to the hotel's telephone booth, her fingers dialing a number she knew by heart. The line crackled, and a familiar voice answered, precise, B, and accented with Belgian clarity. "Oui, this is Hercule Poirot." "Hercule, it's Ariadne," she said, her voice brimming with excitement. "I've stumbled into something rather extraordinary. A mystery, 12 years old, and a woman with far too much nerve. Can you spare an afternoon for an old friend?" Poirot's chuckle was warm, tinged with curiosity. "Madame Oliver, you have the gift of making the mundane magnifique. Tell me more." The next morning, Ariadne arrived at Poirot's flat in Whitehaven Mansions, a modest yet elegant space that reflected its occupant's meticulous nature. The room smelled faintly of lavender, polish, and coffee, and the shelves gleamed with leather-bound books. Poirot, dapper in a pinstripe suit, his mustache waxed to perfection, greeted her with a courtly bow. "You look well, mon ami," he said, gesturing to a plush armchair. "But your eyes, they sparkle with intrigue. What is this mystery you bring to Hercule Poirot?" Ariadne settled into the chair, her hands animated as she recounted the luncheon encounter. She described Mrs. Burton Cox's audacious demand, the Ravenscroft tragedy, and her own nagging sense that the case was more than it seemed. Poirot listened, his green eyes sharp, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "The Ravenscrofts," he mused when she finished. I recall the case. A tragedy most perplexing. 2 bodies, a revolver, no witnesses, and an inquest that satisfied no one. The police, they called it a double suicide, but the public, they whispered of murder." "Exactly," Ariadne exclaimed, leaning forward. "And now this Burton Cox woman practically accusing Celia's parents of some dark secret. It's preposterous, but what if there's something to it? Celia deserves to know the truth, Hercule. She's a dear girl, and this engagement business shouldn't be tainted by old ghosts." Poirot's expression grew thoughtful. "The truth, Madame Oliver, is like a fine tapestry. Pull one thread, and the whole may unravel. But why does this Mrs. Burton Cox care so deeply? A mother's concern, perhaps, but I sense Autre chose something more." Ariadne nodded, her novelist's mind spinning. "She's hiding something, I'm sure of it." Her eyes had that look you know, the kind a villain has in a third act when they think they've outsmarted everyone. Poirot smiled, a rare glint of amusement. "You see villains everywhere, mon ami. But your instincts, they are not to be dismissed. Let us begin where all good mysteries start, with the past. Who knew the Ravenscrofts? Who saw them last? And what memories linger like elephants, never forgetting?" Ariadne clapped her hands. "Elephants. That's it, Hercule. We'll find the people who remember their friends, servants, neighbors. Someone must know something." "Precisement," Poirot said, rising with a spark of energy. "But we must proceed with care. Old wounds, they bleed anew when disturbed. I will make inquiries, and you, Madame Oliver, will speak to your goddaughter. Let us see what Celia Ravenscroft recalls of that fateful day." The following day, Ariadne drove to Celia's flat in Chelsea, a cozy attic space filled with books and watercolor sketches. Celia, a willowy young woman with her mother's auburn hair and a quiet strength, greeted Ariadne with a warm embrace. The flat smelled of jasmine tea, and sunlight streamed through a skylight, illuminating a photograph of Margaret and Alistair Ravenscroft on the mantel, a smiling couple, arms entwined, against a backdrop of cliffs and sea. Doppler quotes Mrs. Oliver. "I didn't expect you," Celia said, her eyes bright but shadowed with curiosity. "Is this about the luncheon?" Desmond mentioned his mother was rather forward. Ariadne chuckled, settling onto a worn velvet sofa. "Forward is a polite way to put it. Celia, darling, I need to ask you something delicate. It's about your parents. Mrs. Burton Cox brought up their deaths, and I can't shake the feeling there's more to the story. Do you remember anything from that time?" Celia's smile faded, her fingers tightening around her teacup. "I was only 14, Mrs. Oliver. It's all a blur. School holidays, the shock of it all. I remember Mother loved her garden, and Father was always polishing his medals, telling stories of India. They seemed happy, but there was something, a tension, maybe. I thought it was just grown-up things I didn't understand." Ariadne leaned forward, her voice gentle. "Anything specific, Celia? Even a small detail could help." Celia hesitated, her gaze drifting to the photograph. "There was a woman who visited sometimes. Aunt Dolly, they called her. Mother's sister, I think. But I barely saw her. She was odd. Father didn't like her visits. And then, after they died, she was gone, too. I don't know what happened to her." Ariadne's pulse quickened. A sister Margaret's twin, perhaps. The detail was new, a thread to tug. "Thank you, Celia. This is helpful. And don't worry, we'll sort this out. You and Desmond deserve a clean slate." Celia's eyes softened. "I just want to know they were happy, Mrs. Oliver. That's all." Back at Whitehaven Mansions, Ariadne relayed Celia's revelation to Poirot over a pot of his cherished tisane. The mention of Aunt Dolly sparked a flicker of recognition in Poirot's eyes. "Dorothea Dro," he said, his voice low. "Margaret Ravenscroft's twin sister. I recall whispers of her troubled woman, Nan, institutionalized at one time. Perhaps this is a piece of the puzzle, Madame Oliver. We must find those who knew Dorothea, who saw her with the Ravenscrofts, and we must learn why Mrs. Burton Cox is so determined to unearth this past." Ariadne grinned, the thrill of the chase igniting her imagination. "It's like one of my novels, Hercule, but better. We're not just solving a crime, we're resurrecting a memory." Poirot's mustache twitched. "And memories, mon ami, are the most dangerous clues of all. They shift, they deceive, but they never truly forget. Let us begin our hunt for the elephants." As Ariadne left Poirot's flat, the crisp autumn air carried a hint of mystery. The Ravenscroft case, dormant for 12 years, was alive again, its secrets waiting to be uncovered. Mrs. Burton Cox's intrusion had set a chain in motion, and Ariadne felt the familiar thrill of a story unfolding, one that promised twists, truths, and perhaps a touch of tragedy. Chapter 2. Poirot's Pensive Reflections. The late autumn light filtered through the heavy velvet curtains of Hercule Poirot's London apartment, casting a warm amber glow across the room. The air carried the faint scent of polished wood and the lingering aroma of his morning tisane, a blend of chamomile and mint that he sipped with meticulous care. His small, precise hands rested on the arms of a high-backed chair, fingers drumming lightly as he gazed out the window at the bustling street below. The world outside moved in its usual frenetic dance, but within these walls time seemed to pause, held in check by the quiet rhythm of Poirot's thoughts. He was older now, his moustache still impeccably waxed, though the silver at his temples had spread like frost across a window-pane. His eyes, sharp as ever, flickered with a spark of curiosity that no years could dim. The Ravenscroft case, though 12 years cold, had stirred something in him, a faint ripple in the still pond of his mind. Ariadne Oliver's visit earlier that day had been the stone that caused it. The door creaked open, and George, his ever-reliable valet, entered with a tray bearing a fresh pot of tisane and a plate of delicate almond biscuits. "Will you be requiring anything else, sir?" George asked, his voice as measured as the ticking of the mantel clock. "Nand, George." "Merci," Poirot replied, his accent as crisp as the starched collar of his shirt. "But do ensure that Madame Oliver's coat is returned to her. She left it in her haste, and I suspect she will not notice until the chill of evening reminds her." George inclined his head. "Very good, sir." He retreated, leaving Poirot alone with his reflections. Ariadne's visit had been a whirlwind, as always. She had burst into his apartment like a gust of wind through an open window, her scarf trailing behind her like a comet's tail. Her words had tumbled out in a rush, punctuated by dramatic gestures and the occasional apple she plucked from his fruit bowl, biting into it with the enthusiasm of a schoolgirl. The literary luncheon, the intrusive Mrs. Burton-Cox, the question about the Ravenscrofts, it was all so very Ariadne. Yet beneath her theatrical recounting lay a genuine unease, a puzzle that tugged at her instincts as a writer of mysteries. And now it tugged at Poirot's as well. He rose from his chair, his movements deliberate, and crossed to the small mahogany desk, where a leather-bound notebook lay open. His fingers traced the edge of the page, where he had jotted a single phrase. In his neat, precise script, Ravenscroft, murder or suicide. The question was simple, but its implications sprawled like the roots of an ancient tree. Alistair and Margaret Ravenscroft, found dead on a cliffside path near their Overcliff manor, a revolver between them. The inquest had been inconclusive, the case filed away as a tragic enigma. Yet Mrs. Burton-Cox's question, posed with such audacity to Ariadne, suggested that the past was not content to remain buried. Poirot sipped his tisane, the warmth spreading through him as he considered the facts. Alistair, a retired general, had been a man of discipline and honor by all accounts. Margaret, his wife, was described as gracious, reserved, with a quiet strength that complemented her husband's military bearing. Their deaths had shocked their small circle friends, servants, and their young daughter, Celia, who was now a woman of 25, engaged to the son of the very woman who had stirred this hornet's nest. What had prompted Mrs. Burton Cox to ask such a question, and why now? Poirot's moustache twitched. There was motive here, hidden beneath the surface, like a fish gliding just below the water's edge. He set the cup down and paced the room, his polished shoes clicking softly on the hardwood floor. The Ravenscroft case was not one he had worked on, but he remembered the headlines, the whispers in drawing rooms. A double death, a revolver with both their fingerprints, no witnesses, save the wind and the sea. The police had leaned toward suicide, a pact born of some private despairs. But the absence of a note, the ambiguity of the scene, had left room for doubt. Murder, suicide, perhaps, or something else entirely. Poirot's mind, so accustomed to order, rebelled against the lack of clarity. He paused by the window, watching a pigeon strut along the sill. "You, mon petit ami," he murmured, "you see much, but you do not speak." If only the cliffs of Overcliff could be so observant and yet so silent. The pigeon cooed, oblivious, and Poirot smiled faintly. Nature, he thought, was a witness, bent of sorts, but it required a human mind to interpret its testimony. His thoughts drifted to Ariadne's account of the luncheon. Mrs. Burton Cox had been brazen, her question less a query than a demand. "Do you know which of Celia's parents killed the other, or was it a suicide?" The words, as Ariadne had relayed them, carried a weight of presumption, as if the answer were a mere trifle to be plucked from the air. Poirot's lips pursed. Such a question was not born of idle curiosity. It was a probe, a calculated thrust into a wound that had never fully healed. And why Celia? Why now, when the girl was poised to marry Desmond Burton Cox, the woman's son? There was a thread here, and Poirot intended to pull it until the tapestry unraveled. He returned to his desk, flipping open the notebook to a fresh page. With a fountain pen, he began to write, his hand steady and precise. Ravenscroft case. Initial observations. The incident. Alistair and Margaret Ravenscroft. Found dead. October 1960. Revolver between them. Both fingerprints present. No suicide note. Inquest inconclusive. The question. Mrs. Burton Cox, mother of Desmond, fiancée of Celia Ravenscroft, asks Ariadne Oliver whether it was murder or suicide. Motive for inquiry unknown, but suspect personal gain or leverage. The players: Celia Ravens' daughter, now 25, Desmond Burton Cox, fiancé, adopted son of Mrs. Burton Cox, Ariadne Oliver, godmother to Celia, conduit to Poirot. The challenge: 12 years have passed. Witnesses scattered, memories faded or altered, physical evidence likely gone. Solution lies in human recollection and hidden motives. He paused, tapping the pen against his chin. The challenge was formidable, but not insurmountable. The human mind, Poirot believed, was a vault of secrets, and even the most guarded could be unlocked with the right key. Ariadne's suggestion to seek out those who had known, the Ravenscrofts, to stir their memories had merit. But where to begin? The servants, perhaps, who had seen the daily rhythms of the household. The friends who had dined at Overcliff, laughing over claret while secrets simmered beneath the surface. Or Celia herself, whose childhood memories might hold fragments of truth, like pieces of a shattered mirror. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Entress," he called, expecting George with some minor errand. Instead, Ariadne Oliver swept in, her hat slightly askew, a new apple in hand. "Poirot, I've had a thought," she declared, waving the fruit like a conductor's baton. "I completely forgot to mention there was something odd about that luncheon, beyond Mrs. Burton Cox's rudeness." Poirot gestured to a chair, his eyes narrowing with interest. "Sit, madame, and tell me of this oddity. Every detail. It matters." Ariadne flopped into the chair, her scarf slipping to the floor. "Well, it's probably nothing, but there was a woman at the luncheon, a Mrs. Carstairs. She didn't say much, but when Mrs. Burton Cox asked me about the Ravenscrofts, I swear I saw her flinch. Just a tiny movement, like she'd been pricked with a pin. And then she excused herself rather quickly, said she had a headache." Poirot leaned forward, his hands clasped. "This Mrs. Carstairs, you know her?" "Barely," Ariadne admitted, taking a bite of the apple. "She's one of those literary types, always hovering at the edges of events. Writes poetry, I think. Or maybe it's short stories. Anyway, she knew the Ravenscrofts mentioned once that she'd visited Overcliff years ago. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now, well, it's stuck in my mind like a burr." "A burr, indeed," Poirot murmured. "And what else do you recall of her? Her demeanor, her connections?" Ariadne frowned, chewing thoughtfully. Quiet, a bit nervous. Kept twisting her napkin during the luncheon. She's widowed, I think. Lives in a flat in Chelsea. "Oh, and she mentioned something about a dog, once a spaniel, I think. Said it reminded her of the Ravenscrofts' dog. Funny thing to bring up, don't you think?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "The dog, oui, a detail most curious. Animals, they do not lie, madame. They sense what we cannot." He made a note in his book, Mrs. Carstairs' possible witness, reaction to Ravenscroft question, connection to dog. Ariadne leaned forward, her eyes bright with excitement. "So, what's our next step? Shall I track down Mrs. Carstairs? Or perhaps Celia? She's such a dear girl. But I hate to drag her through all this pain again." Poirot raised a hand. "Patience, Madame Oliver." The mind of Poirot, it works, like the gears of a fine clock, slowly, precisely, until the hour is struck. "We will begin with the witnesses, those who were close to the Ravenscrofts. Mrs. Carstairs, she is a thread to follow. But we must also consider Celia, for her memories, though clouded by youth, may hold the key. And this Mrs. Burton Cox. Motives must be uncovered. I will employ Mr. Goby, my most discreet investigator, to learn more of her affairs." Ariadne clapped her hands. "Oh, Mr. Goby, that little man who looks like he could blend into the wallpaper. He's marvelous. Isn't he always digging up the most astonishing tidbits?" "Indeed," Poirot said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "And while Mr. Goby works, I shall consult my own resources, my little grey cells. They have not failed me yet. The conversation shifted to logistics, with Ariadne proposing a visit to Celia and Poirot suggesting a review of old newspaper clippings from the Ravenscroft case. As they spoke, Poirot's mind wandered to the revolver, that silent witness to the tragedy. Why both fingerprints? Why no note? And what had driven Mrs. Burton Cox to stir this long-dormant pain? He felt the familiar thrill of the chase, the puzzle taking shape like a mosaic in his mind, as Ariadne prepared to leave, promising to return with any new insights. Poirot stood at his window once more, watching the world below. The pigeon had returned, joined by another, their soft cooing a counterpoint to the city's hum. "The past," he murmured, "it is like the shadow of these birds, fleeting, yet ever present. We shall find you, Mies, Amos, and the truth you guard." He turned back to his notebook, adding one final line. "The truth lies not in the facts alone, but in the spaces between them." The Ravenscroft case was a challenge, but Hercule Poirot had never shied from a mystery. With Ariadne's passion and his own precision, they would uncover the secrets buried in the mists of memory, one careful step at a time. The afternoon faded, to evening, and Poirot sat in the quiet of his apartment, the weight of the case settling around him like a familiar cloak. He closed his eyes, letting his thoughts drift, trusting that his little grey cells would begin their silent work, weaving the threads of the past into a pattern only he could see. Chapter 3. The Elephants of Memory. The late afternoon sun spilled golden light through the tall windows of Hercule Poirot's London apartment, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany table where he sat with Ariadne Oliver. The air smelled faintly of lavender polish and the sharp tang of Poirot's herbal tisane steaming in a delicate porcelain cup. Ariadne, her hat askew and a notebook spilling with scribbled names, leaned forward, her eyes bright with the thrill of a new mystery. "Elephants, Poirot," she declared, tapping her pen against the page. "That's what we need, people with memories like elephants. The ones who never forget a face, a word, a whisper from 12 years ago. They'll tell us what really happened to the Ravenscrofts." Poirot's moustache twitched, a faint smile playing beneath it. "Been, sir, Madame Oliver. The human memory is a curious vault-some. Lock it tight. Others leave it ajar, letting fragments escape. We shall find these elephants of yours and see what treasures they guard." Ariadne's enthusiasm was infectious, but Poirot's mind was already turning, methodical and precise, like a watchmaker assembling gears. The Ravenscroft Kaiser, husband and wife, found dead on a cliffside, a revolver between them. No clear answers had been a puzzle left unsolved for over a decade. Now, stirred by Mrs. Burton Cox's intrusive question at a literary luncheon, Ariadne had dragged it back into the light. Poirot, though older and slower in step, felt the familiar spark of curiosity ignite. A cold case was a challenge to his cellulose grises, his little grey cells, and he would not let it rest. Their plan was simple but bold. Track down those who knew the Ravenscrofts' servants, neighbors, friends, anyone whose memory might hold a shard of truth. Ariadne, with her knack for charming conversation out of strangers, would lead the charge, while Poirot would probe with his surgical precision. But first Ariadne insisted on visiting Celia Ravenscroft, her goddaughter, whose parents' deaths were at the heart of this mystery. Celia, now a poised young woman of 25, was engaged to Desmond Burton-Cox, the adopted son of the very woman who had sparked this investigation. Her stake in the truth was personal, raw, and undeniable. The train to Oxfordshire rattled along, its rhythm a steady counterpoint to Ariadne's restless thoughts. She sat by the window, watching fields blur past, their green broken by bursts of wildflowers. Her notebook lay open on her lap, filled with names of potential elephants. A gardener who had worked at the Ravenscroft estate, a village postmistress, known for her gossip, a childhood friend of Celia's, who might recall odd details. But it was Celia herself who weighed on Ariadne's mind. The girl had been only 13 when her parents died, old enough to remember, but young enough for those memories to be clouded by grief. The Ravenscroft estate. Overcliff was a sprawling manor nestled on a cliff overlooking the sea, its stone walls weathered but grand. Ariadne arrived at Celia's modest cottage nearby, a far cry from the opulence of her childhood home. The door swung open, and Celia stood there, her dark hair pulled back, her grey eyes sharp but wary. She wore a simple linen dress, and her fingers fidgeted with a silver locket around her necker keepsake, Ariadne guessed, from her mother. Ariadne, Celia's smile was warm but strained. "I wasn't expecting you. Is this about Mrs. Burton?" Ariadne stepped inside, her scarf trailing as she took in the cozy sitting-room bookshelves crammed with novels, a vase of fresh daisies, a faint scent of lemon polish. "Yes, my dear, I'm afraid so." That woman's question at the luncheon about your parents had stirred things up. I've brought Hercule Poirot into it, and we're determined to find out what happened. But I need your help. Your memories. Celia's face tightened, and she sank into an armchair, gesturing for Ariadne to sit. I've tried so hard to forget, you know. But some things, they don't fade. What do you want to know? Ariadne opened her notebook, softening her tone. Anything you remember about that time. Your parents, the house, the people around you. Even the smallest detail might matter. Celia's gaze drifted to the window, where the distant sea glinted under the sun. "It's strange," she began, her voice low. "I can still see the house so clearly, Overcliff, with its big oak doors and the rose garden Mother loved. I remember her brushing my hair, telling me stories about her travels with Father. They were happy, I think, but there were moments, odd ones, that didn't make sense then." Ariadne leaned forward, pen poised. "Odd how?" Celia hesitated, her fingers tightening on the locket. "There was a day, maybe a month before they died, when Mother seemed different. She was in the garden, cutting roses, but her hands were shaking, and she kept looking over her shoulder, like she was expecting someone. I asked if she was all right, and she smiled, but it wasn't her real smile. It was tight, forced. Father bores away that weeksome military conference. I think when he came back, they argued. Not loudly, but I heard them through the walls at night. Mother kept saying, "She can't stay here, Alistair. It's not safe." Ariadne's pulse quickened. "Sheesh. Did you ever hear a name?" Celia shook her head. "No. I thought it was about me at first, but I was at boarding school most of the time. It had to be someone else. And then there was the dog Biscuit, our spaniel. He was so gentle. But one day he growled at Mother, bared his teeth. I'd never seen him do that. She laughed it off, but I could tell she was shaken." Ariadne scribbled furiously, the word dog underlined twice. "This is good, Celia. Anything else?" "Visitors, perhaps. Someone who stood out." Celia frowned, her brow creasing. "There was a woman who came to the house sometimes. I only saw her once or twice, always from a distance. She looked like Mother, but not quite. Same height, same dark hair, but she moved differently, more restless. I thought she was a cousin or something, but no one ever introduced her. The servants whispered about her, though. I overheard the cook saying she was trouble and shouldn't be let in." Ariadne. Pen froze. A woman who looked like Margaret Ravenscroft. The possibility sent a shiver through her. "Did you ever hear her name?" "No," Celia said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I remember the last time I saw her. It was a week before it happened. She was standing by the cliff edge, just staring at the sea. I was in my room, looking out the window. She didn't see me, but I felt scared, like she didn't belong there." Ariadne reached out, squeezing Celia's hand. "You've done wonderfully, my dear. This is exactly what we need. I'll tell Poirot about this woman, and we'll dig deeper. You're sure you don't mind us poking around?" Celia's eye hardened with resolve. "I need to know the truth, Ariadne. For me, for Desmond. Mrs. Burton Cox, she's trying to use this against us, to stop our engagement. I won't let her." Ariadne nodded, her heart swelling with pride for her goddaughters. "Strength. We'll get to the bottom of it, I promise." Back in London, Poirot listened as Ariadne recounted her visit, his fingers steepled under his chin. The apartment was quiet now, the evening settling in with a soft hum of city sounds beyond the windows. Ariadne paced, her energy a stark contrast to Poirot's stillness. "A woman who looked like Margaret," Poirot mused, his voice low and deliberate. "This is most intriguing, Madame Oliver. A twin, perhaps, or a clever impostor. Car. And the dogman. Dear, the dog. Animals. They do not lie." If this Biscuit growled, he sensed something amiss. Ariadne stopped pacing, her eyes wide. "A twin. Oh, Poirot, that's brilliant. It would explain so much, the whispers, the secrecy. But who is she, and why was she there?" Poirot's gaze sharpened. "We must find these elephants of yours. Madame, the servants, the neighbors, anyone who saw this mysterious woman. But we must also be cautious. Memories are fragile, and 12 years is a long time. They may be colored by time, by fear, or by loyalty." Ariadne nodded, flipping through her notebook. "I've got a list. There's Mrs. Tuttle, the postmistress in the village. She knew everyone's business. And Mr. Grayson, the gardener. He was at Overcliff for years. Oh, and Julia Carstairs, Celia's old school friend. She spent a summer with the Ravenscrofts when they were children. Excellent, Poirot said, rising with a spryness that belied his age. You will visit these elephants, madame, and I shall make inquiries of my own. My old friend Superintendent Spence may recall details of the case, and Mr. Goby, how do you say, Limia, my bloodhound of information. He will sniff out what the official records hide. Ariadne grinned, already imagining the conversations ahead. We're a good team, Poirot. You with your grey cells, me with my knack for getting people to talk. Poirot inclined his head, a twinkle in his eye. Naturellement. Now, let us hunt these elephants and see what secrets they carry. The next morning, Ariadne set out for the village of St. Mary's Bay, a quaint cluster of stone cottages near Overcliff. The air was crisp, scented with salt and heather, and the sea roared faintly in the distance. Mrs. Tuttle's post office was a tiny shop, its counter cluttered with stamps and parcels. The woman herself, stout and grey-haired, peered over her glasses with a mix of curiosity and suspicion as Ariadne introduced herself. A mystery novelist, Mrs. Tuttle said, her voice rich with the local burr. Come to stir up old ghosts, have you? Ariadne smiled, leaning on the counter. Not ghosts, Mrs. Tuttle. Memories. I'm looking into the Ravenscrofts, Margaret and Alistair. You must have known them, living here. Mrs. Tuttle's eyes narrowed, but a spark of interest flickered. Oh, I knew them. Fine folk. The Ravenscrofts, though they kept to themselves, mostly. Terrible what happened. Shot both of them up by the cliffs. No one ever knew why. Ariadne nodded, easing into her questions. I'm trying to piece it together. Celia, their daughter, deserves to know. Did you ever notice anyone unusual at Overcliff? A woman, perhaps, who looked like Mrs. Ravenscroft? Mrs. Tuttle's hands stilled on a stack of letters, her lips pursing. Now that you mention it, there was a woman years back. Looked so like Mrs. Ravenscroft I thought it was her at first, till I saw her up close. Same face, but her eyes wild. They came to the post office once, asking for letters addressed to a Miss Jarrow. I told her nothing came for that name, and she left in a huff. Jarrow, Ariadne's heart skipped. Did you catch her first name? Mrs. Tuttle shook her head, never said it. But I heard from the butcher's wife that she was Mrs. Ravenscroft's sister. Not a nice sort, they said. Caused trouble wherever she went. Ariadne scribbled the name Jarrow in her notebook, her mind racing. Anything else you remember about her? Or about the Ravenscrofts that last summer? Mrs. Tuttle leaned closer, her voice dropping. There was talk, you know. The servants said things weren't right at Overcliff. Mrs. Ravenscroft was jumpy, always looking out windows. And that dog of theirs, Biscuit, wasn't it? He turned strange. Bit her once, they said. Never heard of him doing that before. Ariadne's pulse quickened. The dog again. Thank you, Mrs. Tuttle. You've been a tremendous help. If you think of anything else, will you let me know? Mrs. Tuttle nodded, already turning back to her parcels. Mind you, don't go stirring up too much trouble. Some things are best left buried. Ariadne's next stop was the old gardener, Mr. Grayson, who lived in a tidy cottage on the edge of the village. His garden was a riot of color roses, lavender, and foxgloves swaying in the breeze. Grayson himself was a wiry man in his 70s, his hands calloused from years of tending Overcliff's grounds. He invited Ariadne in for tea, his eyes crinkling with warmth but shadowed by memory. The Ravenscrofts were good employers, he said, pouring tea into chipped mugs. Mrs. Ravenscroft loved her roses, used to spend hours in that garden, pruning, planting. But that last summer she wasn't herself. Ariadne sipped the tea, strong and bitter. How so? Grayson rubbed his chin, staring out the window. She was distracted, like she was waiting for something bad to happen. Once, I saw her arguing with a woman in the garden, not Mrs. Ravenscroft, but someone who looked like her. Same face, but thinner, sharper. They were by the rose arbor, and the woman was shouting, waving her arms. Mrs. Ravenscroft looked afraid. Ariadne's pen flew across the page. Did you hear what they were saying? Not much, Grayson admitted. Something about you can't keep doing this, and he'll find out. I didn't want to eavesdrop, so I went back to my work. But I never saw that woman again, not till, well, you know. Ariadne's breath caught, till the day they died. Grayson nodded, his face grim. I wasn't there, mind you. I'd been let go a week before budget cuts, they said. But I heard the talk, 2 shots, up by the cliffs, and that revolver. No one could say whose hand fired it. Ariadne thanked him, her mind buzzing with fragments. Jero, the dog, the argument in the garden. As she left, Grayson called after her, "Be careful, Mrs. Oliver. Some memories don't want to be dug up." That evening, Ariadne met Julia Carstairs, Celia's childhood friend, at a small cafe in Oxford. Julia was a vibrant woman with auburn hair and a quick laugh, but her expression sobered when Ariadne mentioned the Ravenscrofts. "I was 12 that summer," Julia said, stirring her coffee. "Celia and I were inseparable, running around Overcliff, playing hide-and-seek. But there was this shadow over the house. Mrs. Ravenscroft was always watching us, like she was afraid we'd get too close to something. Ariadne prompted Dot. Julia shrugged. "I don't know. The cliffs, maybe. Or that woman. I saw her once, in the library. She was reading one of Mr. Ravenscroft's old military journals, flipping through it like she was looking for something. I thought she was Mrs. Ravenscroft at first, but Celia whispered, 'That's not my mother.' She wouldn't say more, just pulled me away." Ariadne's heart pounded. Did Celia ever talk about her? "Not really," Julia said. "But I remember the dog." Biscuit followed Celia everywhere, but he wouldn't go near that woman. Once he barked at her, and she threw a book at him. Celia was furious, but the woman just laughed. It was chilling. Ariadne jotted down every word, her excitement tempered by unease. This woman Jero, the sister, the look-alike, was emerging as a key figure, her presence a thread weaving through every memory. But who was she? And what had she done to cast such a shadow over Overcliff? Back in London, Ariadne burst into Poirot's apartment, her notebook brimming with notes. Poirot, you won't believe it. A woman who looked like Margaret, called Jarrow by the postmistress, arguing in the garden, scaring the dog, reading military journals. It's all connected. Poirot, seated by the fire with a glass of sirop de cassis, raised an eyebrow. Calm yourself, madame. Tell me everything slowly. Ariadne recounted her day, the postmistress's gossip, Grayson's tale of the argument, Julia's memory of the library. Poirot listened, his eyes half closed, but missing nothing. C'est magnifique, he said at last. This woman, this Jarrow, she is the key. A sister, perhaps, or a masquerade. And the dog, mon Dieu, the dog does not lie. We must find more of these elephants, but we must also seek records, letters, diaries, anything that names this Jarrow. Ariadne grinned, exhaustion giving way to exhilaration. We're getting closer, Poirot. I can feel it. Poirot nodded, his expression grave. Yes, madame, but be warned. The closer we get, the more dangerous this truth may become. The chapter closed with the mystery deepening, the elephants of memory yielding, tantalizing clues. A woman who mirrored Margaret, a dog's instinct, whispered arguments, and a name, Jarrow. Ariadne and Poirot stood on the edge of a revelation, their hunt for the truth just beginning, pulling listeners into a web of intrigue that promised more secrets to come. Chapter 4. Whispers of wigs. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cobbled streets of St. Mary Mead, where Ariadne Oliver had arranged to meet Miss Daphne Tremaine, a retired hairdresser who had once styled wigs for Margaret Ravenscroft. The village, with its quaint tear-rooms and ivor-clad cottages, seemed an unlikely stage for unraveling a 12-year-old tragedy. Yet Ariadne felt a prickle of anticipation. The air carried the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming roses. But beneath the idyllic surface, she sensed the weight of secrets, waiting to be teased apart like strands of hair. Ariadne adjusted her wide-brimmed hat, a flamboyant accessory she'd chosen to offset the somber purpose of her visit. Her mind buzzed with the peculiar detail Hercule Poirot had uncovered. Margaret Ravenscroft owned 4 wigs. Why 4? Most women of Margaret's station might own 1, perhaps 2, 4. Convenience or fashion, but for suggested something more deliberate, something hidden. Ariadne's novelist instincts flared. She imagined disguises, clandestine meetings, or perhaps a deeper psychological quirk. She needed facts, not fancies, and Miss Tremaine, with her sharp memory and sharper tongue, was the key. That the Rose and Kettle was a cozy affair with lace curtains and mismatched china. Ariadne spotted Miss Tremaine at a corner table, her silver hair pinned neatly, her posture rigid as if she were still wielding a comb and scissors. The older woman's eyes, bright and assessing, flicked up as Ariadne approached, her stout frame settling into a chair with a rustle of her tweed skirt. Miss Tremaine. I'm Ariadne Oliver. Thank you for meeting me on such short notice. Daphne Tremaine's lips curved into a thin smile, her fingers tapping the edge of her teacup. Mrs. Oliver, the mystery writer. I read The Body in the Orchard. Quite a clever twist with the poisoned cider. I suppose you're here about Margaret Ravenscroft's wigs." Ariadne blinked, caught off guard by the directness. "You're well informed. I make it my business to know who's asking about my old clients," Daphne said, her voice crisp. Margaret was particular about her wigs. Not many knew she wore them. She wasn't vain. Mind you, more methodical. Ariadne leaned forward, her curiosity sharpening. Methodical how? For wigs seem excessive for most women, even those with a taste for style. Daphne's eyes narrowed, as if weighing how much to reveal. She sipped her tea, the clink of the cup against the saucer the only sound for a moment. "Margaret wasn't like most women. She came to me 15 years ago, before I retired. Wanted wigs that were identical to her natural hair, same shade, same texture, same cut. No one was to know she wore them. I thought it odd, but I didn't pry. Clients have their reasons." Ariadne scribbled a note in her battered notebook, her pen scratching furiously. "Identical. That's unusual. Most women choose variety, different colors, lengths. Not Margaret." Daphne's voice softened, a hint of nostalgia creeping in. She wanted them to blend seamlessly. She'd come in every few months, to have them maintained, cleaned, restyled, always paid in cash, always alone. She'd sit in my salon, quiet as a mouse, but her eyes, they'd dart about like she was expecting someone to burst in. Ariadne's pulse quickened. This was no mere fashion quirk. Margaret Ravenscroft had been guarding something, perhaps her identity, perhaps her safety. Did she ever mention why she needed them? Any personal reasons? Daphne hesitated, her fingers tightening round her teaspoon. Once she let slip something about keeping up appearances. I thought she meant socially, but there was a weight to her words. She was tense, always checking the time. I got the sense she was protecting someone or hiding from someone. Ariadne's mind raced, protecting someone, hiding. The Ravenscroft case, with its ambiguous double death, was growing thornier by the minute. She pressed further. "Did you ever meet her husband, Alistair, or anyone else from her circle? Her sister, perhaps?" Daphne's expression darkened at the mention of the sister, Dorothea Rowe. "Oh, I saw her once. She came to the salon unannounced, demanding to see Margaret. They looked a like twin, you know, but Dorothea was unhinged. Her hair was wild, her eyes red-rimmed. She shouted something about Margaret owing her. Margaret hustled her out before I could hear more. Never saw her again." Ariadne's pen paused. Dorothea, the troubled twin, was emerging as a shadow over the case. "When was this?" "About a year before the tragedy," Daphne said. "Summer of '60, I'd say. Margaret stopped coming to the salon after that. Sent a note saying she'd manage her wigs herself. I thought it strange, but I didn't question it. Then, well," she trailed off, her gaze distant. "The news came about their deaths." Ariadne felt a chill despite the warm tea-room. Wigs, the secretive behavior, the volatile Whodunit, all pointed to a deeper rift, a fracture in Margaret's carefully curated life. She decided to shift tack, Did Margaret ever mention anything about her home life, her daughter Celia, or her husband's work? Daphne shook her head. She was private. But once, while I was fitting a wig, she mentioned a trip to Ossia, some diplomatic posting with Alistair. Said it was beautiful but exhausting. Too many eyes watching, she said. I didn't think much of it then, but now it felt like she was carrying a burden. Ariadne jotted down Asia and eyes watching. The phrase nagged at her, evoking a sense of surveillance or paranoia. She glanced at Daphne, whose hands now trembled slightly. Miss Tremaine, is there anything else? Even the smallest detail might help. Daphne leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. There was one thing. The last time I saw her, Margaret seemed different. She asked me if I could make a wig quickly, one that wasn't like the others, darker, shorter, almost masculine. I thought it was for a play or costume, but she didn't explain. I made it, delivered it to her manor in Overcliff. That was the last I heard from her. Ariadne's breath caught. A fifth wig, unlike the purse. This was no mere eccentricity, screamed of disguise, of subterfuge. She pressed Daphne for more, but the older woman shook her head, claiming that was all she knew. As Ariadne thanked her and stepped back into the fading sunlight, her mind churned with possibilities. Had Margaret been planning to flee, to impersonate someone else, or was the wig for another person entirely? Back in London, Ariadne met Poirot at his flat, a haven of polished mahogany and orderly bookshelves. The little Belgian detective sat in his armchair, his eyes gleaming with that familiar spark of intellectual pursuit. Ariadne recounted her conversation with Daphne, her voice animated as she described the wig's Dorothea's outburst, and the mysterious fifth wig. Poirot steepled his fingers, his moustache twitching slightly. For wigs, identical, to maintain an illusion of consistency. And then a fifth, so different, darker, shorter. This, Madame Oliver, is not a detail to be ignored. It suggests a purpose beyond vanity, a disguise, perhaps, or a preparation for an act not yet revealed. Ariadne paced, her hat now discarded on a side table. But why? If Margaret was hiding something, who was she hiding from? Her sister, her husband. And what about this Asia? Comment, too many eyes watching. It's as if she felt trapped. Poirot nodded, his gaze distant, the eyes watching. The wigs, between these are threads in a tapestry of deception. Margaret Ravenscroft was a woman of precision, yet her actions suggest fear. We must consider the possibility that she was not merely a victim of circumstance, but an architect of her own secrecy. Ariadne stopped pacing, her eyes widening. You think she was planning something? Something that led to their deaths? Poirot raised a hand, cautioning her enthusiasm. Not so fast, ma chère. We have clues, but not the picture. The wigs are a key, but to what lock? We must find others who knew Margaret's servants, friends, perhaps this governess, Zelimorat, and we must learn more of Dorothea Jarrow. Her shadow looms large. Ariadne nodded, her mind already racing to the next step. I'll check with Celia again. See if she remembers anything about her mother's wigs or her aunt, and I'll track down anyone else who worked at Overcliff. Servants notice things. Bon, Poirot said, his voice firm. But proceed with care. Be past, like an elephant, does not forget, and those who guard its secrets may not welcome our probing. The next morning, Ariadne drove to Overcliff, the Ravenscrofts' former manor, now maintained by a caretaker. The house stood on a cliff, overlooking the sea, its stone facade weathered but imposing. The wind carried a salty temps, and the distant crash of waves added a haunting backdrop. Ariadne's knock was answered by Mrs. Elsie Whittaker, a stout woman in her 60s who had served as the Ravenscrofts' housekeeper. Mrs. Oliver, Elsie said, wiping her hands on her apron. I got your letter. Not sure what I can tell you about the Ravenscrofts. That was a sad business all those years ago. Ariadne followed her into a parlor, its furniture draped in dust sheets. I'm trying to understand Mrs. Ravenscroft better. I heard she wore wigs. Did you ever notice anything unusual about them? Elsie's brow furrowed, her hands fidgeting. Wigs. I knew about them. She'd wear one most days. Always looked natural. But there was one time I saw her in the garden, late at night, wearing a dark wig, short like a man's. I thought I'd imagined it. She never wore it in the house. I didn't ask, mind. It wasn't my place. Ariadne's heart raced. The 5th wig again. When was this? And was she alone? Elsie hesitated, her eyes darting to the window. Must have been a few weeks before it happened. She was alone, pacing by the cliff edge. Looked like she was waiting for someone. I never saw who, if anyone, came. Ariadne pressed further, sensing Elsie's unease. Did you ever see her sister, Dorothea, around that time? Elsie's face tightened. Miss Dorothea. She came once, caused a right scene, shouting at Mrs. Ravenscroft in the drawing-room. I couldn't hear much, but it was about money or some debt. Mr. Ravenscroft sent her away. After that, Mrs. Ravenscroft seemed jumpy, kept to her room more. Ariadne scribbled notes, her mind piecing together fragments. Margaret, pacing by the cliff in a strange wig. Dorothea, demanding something. The tension in the household. She thanked Elsie and left, the sea wind tugging at her coat as she walked back to her car. The manor felt alive with ghosts, each whispering a piece of the truth. That evening, Ariadne sat in her hotel room, poring over her notes. The wigs were no longer a curiosity, but a cornerstone of the mystery. Margaret's meticulous nature, her secretive habits, and the 5th wig pointed to a woman living a double life, for preparing to escape one. Dorothea's presence added a volatile element, her instability a potential catalyst for tragedy. And yet the Asia comment lingered, a cryptic hint of a broader stage. Ariadne phoned Poirot, her voice urgent. Hercule, it's not just the wigs. Margaret was seen wearing the dark one at night by the cliff, like she was waiting for someone. And Dorothea, there was bad blood between them. Money, debts, something personal. Poirot's voice crackled through the line, calm but intense. "Excellent work, Madame Oliver. The cliff, the wig, the sister, these are not coincidences. We must dig deeper into Dorothea's history, and we must find this Zélie Moerat. She may hold the key to Margaret's final days." Ariadne hung up, her mind alight with possibilities. The wigs whispered of deception, the cliff of desperation, and Dorothea of danger. As she stared out at the moonlit sea, she felt the weight of the past pressing closer. Its secrets coiled like a snake ready to strike. Chapter 5. The Dog's Tale. The autumn air carried a crisp bite as Ariadne Oliver stepped off the train at Overcliff Station, a quaint platform nestled in the rolling hills of the English countryside. The station was little more than a weathered, put-in bench and a faded sign, its edges curling like the pages of an old book. She adjusted her hata bold, feathered creation that had drawn more than one curious glance on the journey and scanned the horizon. The Ravenscroft manor, perched on a cliff overlooking the sea, was a 2-mile walk, and Ariadne relished the chance to clear her mind before diving deeper into the mystery. The path to Overcliff wound through fields of goldenrod and bracken, the sea breeze whispering secrets through the tall grasses. Ariadne's thoughts churned as she walked, her writer's imagination painting vivid scenes of the Ravenscrofts' final days. Margaret and Alistair found dead with a revolver between them, their deaths a riddle wrapped in time. And now this peculiar detail about their dogger loyal creature that had turned on Margaret, biting her just days before the tragedy. It was a thread Ariadne couldn't resist tugging, a clue that felt alive, pulsing with meaning. She reached the manor by late afternoon, its stone facade looming against the bruised purple of the sky. The house was grand but weathered, ivy clawing at its walls like fingers gripping a fading memory. The current owners, a retired couple named the Haverfords, had agreed to let her visit, though their tone on the phone had been guarded, as if the house itself carried a weight they'd rather not disturb. Mrs. Haverford greeted her at the door, a slight woman with silver hair pinned tightly back. "Mrs. Oliver, I presume," she said, her voice polite but cool. "You're here about the Ravenscrofts, then?" "Yes," Ariadne replied, offering a warm smile to thaw the chill. "I'm trying to piece together what happened all those years ago. I understand it's a delicate matter, but I'd be grateful for any memories you might share." Mrs. Haverford led her into a parlor smelling of polished wood and lavender. The room was a time capsule dark oak paneling, a fireplace, with a chipped mantel, and a portrait of a stern-faced man in a military uniform, likely Alistair Ravenscroft himself. Ariadne's eyes lingered on it, searching for clues in the painted gaze. "We bought the place 10 years ago," Mrs. Haverford began, settling into a wingback chair. "The estate agent warned us about its history, but we thought it a bargain. Still, the locals talk. They say the house has a shadow that never lifts." Ariadne nodded, her notebook open on her lap. "I'm particularly interested in the Ravenscroft's dog. I've heard it bit Margaret shortly before. Well, before the end." That strikes me as unusual." Mrs. Haverford's lips tightened, and she glanced toward the window where the cliffs dropped sharply to the sea. "The dog, yes. I've heard the stories. The gardeners still mention etold tales from when they worked for the Ravenscrofts. They called him Badger, a scruffy terrier with a limp from some accident in his youth. Devoted to Margaret, they say, followed her everywhere. For him to bite her, it's not natural." Ariadne's pen paused. "Do you know where I might find someone who knew Badger personally? A gardener, perhaps, or a maid?" Mrs. Haverford hesitated, then rose and crossed to a small writing desk. She rummaged through a drawer and produced a tattered address book. "There's Tom Wickham, the head gardener back then. He's retired now, lives in a cottage by the village. Bit of a recluse, but he might talk to you. Mind, he's not fond of strangers." Ariadne thanked her, and, after a cup of overly sweet tea, set off for the village. The walk was shorter this time, the path cutting through a copse of birch trees that rustled like whispering ghosts. Tom Wickham's cottage was a squat, stone building with a garden bursting with late-blooming roses. She knocked, and after a long pause, the door creaked open to reveal a man in his late 60s, his face weathered like the cliffs, his eyes sharp and wary. "Tom Wickham?" Ariadne asked, her tone bright but cautious. "I'm Ariadne Oliver. I'm looking into the Ravenscroft's history, and I hear you knew their dog, Badger." Tom's eyes narrowed, but he stepped aside to let her in. The cottage was cluttered, with gardening tools and stacks of yellowed newspapers, the air thick with the scent of earth and pipe smoke. He gestured to a chair by the hearth, where a fire crackled softly. "Badger, eh?" Tom said, lowering himself into a worn armchair. "What's a fancy writer like you want with an old dog's tale?" Ariadne leaned forward, her curiosity a living thing. "I've heard Badger bit Margaret Ravenscroft just before she died. That doesn't sound like a loyal pet. I'm wondering what might have caused it." Tom lit his pipe, the smoke curling upward like a question mark. "Badger was a good dog, make no mistake. Loved Mrs. Ravenscroft like she was his own kin. Followed her to the cliffs every morning, limping along with that bad leg of his. But that last week, something wasn't right." Ariadne's pulse quickened. "What do you mean, not right?" Tom stared into the fire, his voice low. "Mrs. Ravenscroft, she was different. Usually she'd stop and chat with me, ask about the roses or the apple trees. But that week she was distracted, jumpy, kept looking over her shoulder like she was expecting someone. And Badger, he'd growl when she came near, low and deep, like he didn't trust her no more." Ariadne scribbled furiously, her mind racing. "Did you see the bite happen?" Tom shook his head. "Heard about it from Molly, the maid. Said Mrs. Ravenscroft was in the garden, trying to pet Badger, and he snapped at her hand. Drew blood, too. She laughed it off, Molly said, but her eyes were scared. Next day she stayed inside, and Badger wouldn't go near the house." Ariadne frowned. Did anyone else notice a change in Margaret that week? Tom puffed on his pipe, considering. The General Mr. Ravenscroft, he was quieter than usual, kept to his study, writing letters. "I saw him once, staring out at the cliffs, with a look like he'd seen a ghost. And there was that woman who visited, the one who looked like Mrs. Ravenscroft. Ariadne's pen froze. A woman who looked like her. I, Tom said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Thought it was Mrs. Ravenscroft at first, but her walk was different, heavier. She came up the path one evening, all in black like a shadow. Badger went wild, barking and snarling. Never saw him like that. She left quick, and I never saw her again. Ariadne's mind spun. The twin, Dorothea Jarrow, perhaps. Poirot had mentioned her troubled past, her time in psychiatric care. Could she have been at Overcliff, stirring up trouble? And why would Badger, so loyal to Margaret, turn on her? Whore, someone who looked like her. Did you ever hear anything about Margaret's sister, Dorothea? Ariadne asked. Tom's face darkened. Heard whispers. Folk said she was bad news, caused trouble wherever she went. But I never met her proper. Just saw that woman, and I swear Badger knew something we didn't. Ariadne thanked Tom and left the cottage, her thoughts a tangle of clues. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the cliffs in shades of fire and shadow. She decided to walk to the spot where the Ravenscrofts had died, a cliffside ledge known locally as Lover's Leap. The path was steep, the wind tugging at her coat as she climbed. At the top, the sea stretched endless and grey, waves crashing by against the rocks below with a sound like a heartbeat. She stood where Margaret and Alistair had fallen, the ground still scarred by time. The image of Badger, loyal yet betrayed by some instinct, haunted her. Animals sensed what humans missed: fear, deceit, perhaps even madness. Had Badger detected something in Margaret, or someone posing as her? The thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the wind. Back at her hotel, a cozy inn called the Salty Anchor, Ariadne phoned Poirot. The line crackled, but his voice was as clear as ever, precise and accented with that familiar Belgian lilt. Mon ami, you have been busy, Poirot said. What have you uncovered? Ariadne recounted Tom's story. The bite, the mysterious woman, and Badger's unease. It's as if the dog knew something was wrong, Hercule. He was trying to tell them, but no one listened. Poirot was silent for a moment, and she could almost see him stroking his moustache, his little grey cells humming. The dog, he is the key, perhaps, he said at last. Animals do not lie, Mrs. Oliver. They do not pretend. If Badger turned on Madame Ravenscroft, it was for a reason. Perhaps she was not herself, for not herself at all. Ariadne's breath caught. You mean Dorothea? Could she have been impersonating Margaret? It is a possibility, Poirot said, the twin sister. She is a shadow in this tale, Nan. We must find more of these elephants who remember. But the dog, he speaks to us from the past. We must listen. Ariadne hung up, her mind alight with possibilities. She sat at the desk in her room, the sea's rhythm seeping through the window, and began to write. Not a novel, but notes, part of the puzzle she and Poirot were assembling. Badger's bite was no mere anecdote. It was a warning, a signal from a creature who loved Margaret but sensed a threat. The question was, what or who had he sensed? The next morning, Ariadne sought out Molly, the maid Tom had mentioned. She found her in the village bakery, now a stout woman in her 50s, her hands dusted with flour as she kneaded dough. Molly's eyes widened when Ariadne introduced herself, but she agreed to talk over a cup of tea in the back room. "I was only 19 when it happened," Molly said, her voice soft but steady. "Mrs. Ravenscroft was kind, always asking after my family. But that last week she was off. She'd forget my name, or she'd snap at me for no reason. I thought she was ill, maybe. Then there was the bite. Tell me about it," Ariadne urged, leaning forward, Molly's hands stilled on her teacup. "I was in the garden, hanging laundry. Mrs. Ravenscroft came out, wearing one of her wigs, chestnut one, I think. She called Badger over, but he backed away, ears flat. She reached for him, and he lunged, bit her hand hard enough to make her cry out. I ran over, but she waved me off, said it was nothing, but her hand was bleeding, and she looked frightened." "Did she say anything else?" Ariadne asked. Molly shook her head. "Not to me. But later, I overheard her talking to Mr. Ravenscroft in the study. She said, 'He knows, Alistair. He knows I'm not right.' I didn't think much of it then, but after they died, I wondered." Ariadne's heart raced. "Did you ever see a woman who looked like Mrs. Ravenscroft, someone who wasn't her?" Molly frowned, her brow creasing. "There was one day, maybe a week before, when I saw a woman in the garden at dusk. I thought it was Mrs. Ravenscroft, but she moved differently, slower. I called out, but she didn't answer, just walked toward the cliffs. I never saw her face." Ariadne thanked Molly and stepped back into the village square, the puzzle growing sharper in her mind. The woman in black, the dog's betrayal, Margaret's fear, all pointed to something deeper, something hidden in the shadows of Overcliff. She decided to visit the local vet, Dr. Harold Finch, who had cared for Badger. Perhaps he'd noticed something odd about the dog's behavior. Dr. Finch was a wiry man in his 70s, his office a cluttered den of old medical books and faded photographs of animals. He remembered Badger well, his eyes lighting up at the mention of the terrier. Badger was a character, Dr. Finch said, leaning back in his chair. Tough little fellow, despite that limp. Mrs. Ravenscroft brought him in regularly, always fussing over him. But the last time I saw him, a few days before the tragedy, he was agitated, wouldn't sit still. I checked him over, nothing wrong, physically, but dogs, they sense things. Stress, fear, even illness in their owner. Did Mrs. Ravenscroft seem ill to you? Ariadne asked. Dr. Finch rubbed his chin. Not ill, exactly. Distracted, like she was carrying a heavy load. She mentioned Badger had been acting strange, growling at her. I told her dogs can pick upon tension in the house. She just nodded, but her eyes, they were haunted. Ariadne left the vet's office with a growing certainty that Badger's bite was no accident. The dog had sensed a change, a threat perhaps Dorothea, masquerading as Margaret. or perhaps something darker in Margaret herself. She returned to the cliffs that evening, unable to shake the image of Badger, loyal to the end, trying to protect his mistress from an unseen danger. As the sun sank into the sea, Ariadne stood at Lover's Leap, the wind carrying the faint echo of waves and secrets. She thought of Poirot's words, "Animals do not lie." Badger's tale was a thread in the tapestry of the Ravenscroft's tragedy, and she was determined to follow it, to unravel the truth that had eluded everyone for 12 years. The dog had spoken, and now it was up to her and Poirot to listen. Chapter 5. The Dog's Tale. The autumn air carried a crisp bite as Ariadne Oliver stepped off the train at Overcliff Station, a quaint platform nestled in the rolling hills of the English countryside. The station was little more than a weathered wooden bench and a faded sign, its edges curling like the pages of an old book. She adjusted her hatter bold, feathered creation that had drawn more than one curious glance on the journey, and scanned the horizon. The Ravenscroft Manor, perched on a cliff overlooking the sea, was a 2-mile walk, and Ariadne relished the chance to clear her mind before diving deeper into the mystery. The path to Overcliff wound through fields of goldenrod and bracken, the sea breeze whispering secrets through the tall grasses. Ariadne's thoughts churned as she walked, her writer's imagination painting vivid scenes of the Ravenscrofts' final days. Margaret and Alistair found dead with a revolver between dens, their deaths a riddle wrapped in time. And now, this peculiar detail about their dogger loyal creature that had turned on Margaret, biting her just days before the tragedy. It was a thread Ariadne couldn't resist tugging, a clue that felt alive, pulsing with meaning. She reached the manor by late afternoon, its stone facade looming against the bruised purple of the sky. The house was grand but weathered, ivy clawing at its walls like fingers gripping a fading memory. The current owners, a retired couple named the Haverfords, had agreed to let her visit, though their tone on the phone had been guarded, as if the house itself carried a weight they'd rather not disturb. Mrs. Haverford greeted her at the door, a slight woman with silver hair pinned tightly back. "Mrs. Oliver, I presume," she said, her voice polite but cool. "You're here about the Ravenscrofts, then?" "Yes," Ariadne replied, offering a warm smile to thaw the chill. "I'm trying to piece together what happened all those years ago. I understand it's a delicate matter, but I'd be grateful for any memories you might share." Mrs. Haverford led her into a parlor smelling of polished wood and lavender. The room was a time-capsule dark oak paneling, a fireplace with a chipped mantel, and a portrait of a stern-faced man in a military uniform, likely Alistair Ravenscroft himself. Ariadne's eyes lingered on it, searching for clues in the painted gaze. "We bought the place 10 years ago," Mrs. Haverford began, settling into a wing-back chair. "The estate agent warned us about its history, but we thought it a bargain. Still, the locals talk. They say the house has a shadow that never lifts." Ariadne nodded, her notebook open on her lap. "I'm particularly interested in the Ravenscroft's dog. I've heard it bit Margaret shortly before. Well, before the end. That strikes me as unusual." Mrs. Haverford's lips tightened, and she glanced toward the window where the cliffs dropped sharply to the sea. "The dog, yes, I've heard the stories. The gardeners still mention it told tales from when they worked for the Ravenscrofts. They called him Badger, a scruffy terrier with a limp from some accident in his youth. Devoted to Margaret, they say, followed her everywhere. For him to bite her, it's not natural." Ariadne's pen paused. "Do you know where I might find someone who knew Badger personally? A gardener, perhaps, or a maid?" Mrs. Haverford hesitated, then rose and crossed to a small writing desk. She rummaged through a drawer and produced a tattered address book. "There's Tom Wickham, the head gardener back then. He's retired now, lives in a cottage by the village. Bit of a recluse, but he might talk to you. Mind, he's not fond of strangers." Ariadne thanked her, and after a cup of overly sweet tea, set off for the village. The walk was shorter this time, the path cutting through a copse of birch trees that rustled like whispering ghosts. Tom Wickham's cottage was a squat stone building, with a garden bursting with late-blooming roses. She knocked, and after a long pause, the door creaked open to reveal a man in his late 60s, his face weathered like the cliffs, his eyes sharp and wary. "Tom Wickham?" Ariadne asked, her tone bright but cautious. "I'm Ariadne Oliver. I'm looking into the Ravenscrofts' history, and I hear you knew their dog, Badger." Tom's eyes narrowed, but he stepped aside to let her in. The cottage was cluttered, with gardening tools and stacks of yellowed newspapers, the air thick with the scent of earth and pipe smoke. He gestured to a chair by the hearth, where a fire crackled softly. "Badger, eh?" Tom said, lowering himself into a worn armchair. "What's a fancy writer like you want with an old dog's tale?" Ariadne leaned forward, her curiosity a living thing. "I've heard Badger bit Margaret Ravenscroft just before she died. That doesn't sound like a loyal pet. I'm wondering what might have caused it." Tom lit his pipe, the smoke curling upward like a question mark. "Badger was a good dog, make no mistake. Loved Mrs. Ravenscroft like she was his own kin. Followed her to the cliffs every morning, limping along with that bad leg of his. But that last week, something wasn't right." Ariadne's pulse quickened. "What do you mean, not right?" Tom stared into the fire, his voice low. "Mrs. Ravenscroft, she was different. Usually she'd stop and chat with me, ask about the roses or the apple trees. But that week she was distracted, jumpy, kept looking over her shoulder, like she was expecting someone. And Badger, he'd growl when she came near, low and deep, like he didn't trust her no more." Ariadne scribbled furiously, her mind racing. "Did you see the bite happen?" Tom shook his head. "Heard about it from Molly, the maid. Said Mrs. Ravenscroft was in the garden, trying to pet Badger, and he snapped at her hand. Drew blood, too." She laughed it off, Molly said, but her eyes were scared. Next day, she stayed inside, and Badger wouldn't go near the house. Ariadne frowned. Did anyone else notice a change in Margaret that week? Tom puffed on his pipe, considering. The General Mr. Ravenscroft, he was quieter than usual. kept to his study, writing letters. I saw him once, staring out at the cliffs with a look like he'd seen a ghost. And there was that woman who visited, the one who looked like Mrs. Ravenscroft. Ariadne's pen froze. A woman who looked like her. Tom said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Thought it was Mrs. Ravenscroft at first, but her walk was different, heavier. She came up the path one evening, all in black, like a shadow. Badger went wild, barking and snarling. Never saw him like that. She left quick, and I never saw her again. Ariadne's mind spun. The twin, Dorothea Gero, perhaps. Poirot had mentioned her troubled past, her time in psychiatric care. Could she have been at Obercliff, stirring up trouble? And why would Badger, so loyal to Margaret, turn on her or someone who looked like her? Did you ever hear anything about Margaret's sister, Dorothea? Ariadne asked. Tom's face darkened. Heard whispers. Folk said she was bad news, caused trouble wherever she went. But I never met her proper. Just saw that woman, and I swear Badger knew something we didn't. Ariadne thanked Tom and left the cottage, her thoughts a tangle of clues. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the cliffs in shades of fire and shadow. She decided to walk to the spot where the Ravenscrofts had died. A cliffside ledge known locally as Lover's Leap. The path was steep, the wind tugging at her coat as she climbed. At the top, the sea stretched endless and grey, waves crashing against the rocks below with a sound like a heartbeat. She stood where Margaret and Alistair had fallen, the ground still scarred by time. The image of Badger, loyal yet betrayed by some instinct, haunted her. Animals sensed what humans missed: fear, deceit, perhaps even madness. Had Badger detected something in Margaret, or someone posing as her? The thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the wind. Back at her hotel, a cuisine called the Salty Anchor. Ariadne phoned Poirot. The line crackled, but his voice was as clear as ever, precise and accented with that familiar Belgian lilt. Mon ami, you have been busy, Poirot said. What have you uncovered? Ariadne recounted Tom's story, the bite, the mysterious woman, and Badger's unease. It's as if the dog knew something was wrong, Hercule. He was trying to tell them, but no one listened. Poirot was silent for a moment, and she could almost see him stroking his moustache, his little grey cells, humming. The dog, he is the key, perhaps, he said at last. Animals do not lie, Mrs. Oliver. They do not pretend. If Badger turned on Madame Ravenscroft, it was for a reason. Perhaps she was not herself for not herself at all. Ariadne's breath caught. You mean Dorothea? Could she have been impersonating Margaret? It is a possibility, Poirot said. The twin sister, she is a shadow in this tale, Nan. We must find more of these elephants who remember. But the dog, he speaks to us from the past. We must listen. Ariadne hung up, her mind alight with possibilities. She sat at the desk in her room, the sea's rhythm seeping through the window, and began to write. Not a novel, but notes, fragments of the puzzle she and Poirot were assembling. Badger's bite was no mere anecdote. It was a warning, a signal from a creature who loved Margaret but sensed a threat. The question was, what or who had he sensed? The next morning, Ariadne sought out Molly, the maid Tom had mentioned. She found her in the village bakery, now a stout woman in her 50s, her hands dusted with flour as she kneaded dough. Molly's eyes widened when Ariadne introduced herself, but she agreed to talk over a cup of tea in the back room. "I was only 19 when it happened," Molly said, her voice soft but steady. "Mrs. Ravenscroft was kind, always asking after my family, but that last week she was off. She'd forget my name, or she'd snap at me for no reason. I thought she was ill, maybe. Then there was the bite. Tell me about it," Ariadne urged, leaning forward. Molly's hands stilled on her teacup. "I was in the garden, hanging laundry. Mrs. Ravenscroft came out, wearing one of her wigs, chestnut one, I think. She called Badger over, but he backed away, ears flat. She reached for him, and he lunged, bit her hand hard enough to make her cry out. I ran over, but she waved me off, said it was nothing, but her hand was bleeding, and she looked frightened." "Did she say anything else?" Ariadne asked. Molly shook her head. "Not to me. But later I overheard her talking to Mr. Ravenscroft in the study. She said, 'He knows, Alistair. He knows I'm not right.' I didn't think much of it then, but after they died, I wondered." Ariadne's heart raced. "Did you ever see a woman who looked like Mrs. Ravenscroft, someone who wasn't her?" Molly frowned, her brow creasing. "There was one day, maybe a week before, when I saw a woman in the garden at dusk. I thought it was Mrs. Ravenscroft, but she moved differently, slower. I called out, but she didn't answer, just walked toward the cliffs. I never saw her face." Ariadne thanked Molly and stepped back into the village square, the puzzle growing sharper in her mind. The woman in black, the dog's betrayal, Margaret's fear-it, all pointed to something deeper, something hidden in the shadows of Overcliff. She decided to visit the local vet, Dr. Harold Finch, who had cared for Badger. Perhaps he'd noticed something odd about the dog's behavior. Dr. Finch was a wiry man in his 70s. His office a cluttered den of old medical books and faded photographs of animals. He remembered Badger well, his eyes lighting up at the mention of the terrier. Badger was a character, Dr. Finch said, leaning back in his chair. Tough little fellow, despite that limp. Mrs. Ravenscroft brought him in regularly, always fussing over him. But the last time I saw him, a few days before the tragedy, he was agitated, wouldn't sit still. I checked him over nothing wrong, physically, but dogs, they sense things. Stress, fear, even illness in their owner. Did Mrs. Ravenscroft seem ill to you?" Ariadne asked. Dr. Finch rubbed his chin. "Not ill, exactly. Distracted, like she was carrying a heavy load. She mentioned Badger had been acting strange, growling at her. I told her dogs can pick up on tension in the house. She just nodded, but her eyes, they were haunted." Ariadne left the vet's office with a growing certainty that Badger's bite was no accident. The dog had sensed a change, a threat perhaps. Dorothea, masquerading as Margaret. Or perhaps something darker in Margaret herself. She returned to the cliffs that evening, unable to shake the image of Badger, loyal to the end, trying to protect his mistress from an unseen danger as the sun sank into the sea. Ariadne stood at Lover's Leap, the wind carrying the faint echo of waves and secrets. She thought of Poirot's words, "Animals do not lie." Badger's tale was a thread in the tapestry of the Ravenscrofts' tragedy, and she was determined to follow it, to unravel the truth that had eluded everyone for 12 years. The dog had spoken, and now it was up to her and Poirot to listen. Chapter 6. Shadows of the Twinned. The late afternoon sun cast long, golden rays through the leaded windows of Ariadne Oliver's London flat, bathing the cluttered room in a warm amber glow. Bookshelves groaned under the weight of novels, manuscripts, bent, half-freed journals, while a vase of wilting peonies drooped on the sideboard. Ariadne sat at her writing desk, a notepad scrawled with names and question marks spread before her. The air was thick with the scent of ink and the faint tang of her morning tea, now cold in its cup. She tapped her pen against her chin, her brow furrowed as she mulled over the Ravenscroft case. The mystery of Margaret and Alistair Ravenscroft's deaths, 12 years past, had taken root in her mind like a stubborn weed, and the latest discovery a fleeting mention of Margaret's identical twin sister. Dorothea Jarrow had sent her thoughts spiraling. Ariadne's fingers paused mid as she recalled Poirot's phone call from the previous evening. His voice, precise yet tinged with intrigue, had carried a weight that made her sit up straighter. "Madame Oliver," he'd said, "this twin, Dorothea Jarrow, she is not merely a shadow in the background. There is something troubling. I have learned she was in Overcliff before the tragedy, and her past it is not so simple as we might wish." His words had lingered, and now, as Ariadne sat in her flat, she felt the pull of that shadow, as if Dorothea's presence loomed over the case like a storm cloud on the horizon. The telephone rang, jarring her from her reverie. She reached for it, nearly knocking over a stack of papers. "Yes, hello," she said, her voice brisk. "Mrs. Oliver, it's Celia," came the reply, soft but edged with urgency. Celia Ravenscroft, Ariadne's goddaughter, sounded as though she'd been pacing. "I've been thinking about what you said about my parents. About everything. I remembered something odd. I don't know if it matters, but there was a woman who visited our house in Overcliff, maybe a month before it happened. I was only 12, but I swear she looked like my mother, exactly like her. I thought it was her at first, but something was off." Ariadne's pulse quickened. "Off? How so, Celia?" "She moved differently," Celia said, her words tumbling out. "Mother was always so graceful, like she was gliding. This woman was jerky, almost like she was nervous. And her eyes, they didn't smile the way Mother's did. I asked Daddy about her, and he said it was just a cousin visiting, but I never saw her again after that." Ariadne scribbled twin Dorothea on her notepad, circling it twice. "Did you tell anyone else about this woman?" "No," Celia admitted. "I was a child. and it felt like a dream, you know. But now, with you asking about my parents, it's come back so clearly. Do you think it means something?" "It might," Ariadne said, her mind racing. "Celia, darling, you've done well to tell me. I'll pass this on to Monsieur Poirot. We'll get to the bottom of it." After hanging up, Ariadne leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. A twin sister, identical yet different, lingering in Overcliff like a ghost. She reached for her coat and scarf, deciding there was no time to waste. If Dorothea Jarrow had been in Overcliff, someone else must have seen her, someone whose memory, like an elephant's, refused to let go. The train to Overcliff rattled along the countryside, its rhythm a steady counterpoint to Ariadne's restless thoughts. She'd telephoned Poirot that morning, and he'd agreed to meet her at the village station, suggesting they visit the Ravenscrofts' former manor, now maintained by a caretaker. "We must speak to those who knew the family," he'd said. "Servants, neighbors, anyone who might recall this twin." His tone had carried a hint of excitement, as if the puzzle pieces were beginning to align in his meticulous mind. Overcliff was a quaint village, nestled between rolling hills, and a jagged coastline where cliffs plunged into the churning sea. The station was little more than a platform with a weathered bench, and Poirot stood waiting, his black patent leather shoes gleaming despite the dust of the platform. His moustache, immaculately trimmed, twitched as he spotted Ariadne descending from the train. "Madame Oliver," he greeted, tipping his hat. "You have the air of one who has uncovered a thread worth pulling." Celia remembered something, Ariadne said, falling into step beside him as they walked toward a waiting taxi. "A woman who looked like Margaret, but wasn't. She was. At the manor a month before the deaths. It has to be Dorothea." Poirot's eyes narrowed, glinting with interest. "C'est possible. And yet we must be cautious. Memory is a fragile thing, madame, like a tapestry that frays with time. We, past, find corroboration." The taxi wound through Overcliff's narrow lanes, past stone cottages draped in ivy and fields dotted with grazing sheep. The Ravenscroft Manor, cliffside house, loomed at the edge of the village, its grey stone walls stark against the green hills. The sea roared faintly in the distance, a constant reminder of the cliffs where tragedy had struck not just for Margaret and Alistair, but for Dorothea too, if the reports of her death were true. The caretaker, a wiry man named Mr. Henshaw, greeted them at the gate. His face was lined with years of wind and work, but his eyes were sharp, taking in Poirot's polished appearance and Ariadne's slightly disheveled scarf with equal curiosity. "Didn't expect visitors," he said gruffly. "House ain't been lived in proper since the Ravenscrofts." "We are not here to disturb the house," Poirot said smoothly. "We seek only to disturb the past. You were employed here 12 years ago. Nest C. Pa." Henshaw nodded, scratching his chin. "I, groundskeeper, then. Knew the family well enough. Terrible thing, what happened." Ariadne leaned forward, her voice eager. "Did you ever meet a woman who looked like Mrs. Ravenscroft? A twin sister, perhaps, Dorothea Henshaw's eyes widened, then darted away, as if the question had stirred something he'd rather forget. Dorothea, he muttered. I saw her. Once or twice, maybe. Looked so like Mrs. Ravenscroft it gave me a start. But she wasn't. Right, not right. Poirot pressed, his tone gentle but insistent. In what way, Monsieur Henshaw? The caretaker shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the cliffs as if they might overhear. She'd come and go, never staying long, always seemed agitated, like Mrs. Ravenscroft. Margaret, she was calm, proper. Dorothea was different, twitchy. Her eyes were always moving, like she was watching for something. I heard from the cook she'd been in a hospital once, some kind of nervous trouble. Ariadne exchanged a glance with Poirot, her excitement barely contained. When was the last time you saw her? Henshaw frowned, thinking. Month or so. Before the shooting. She came one evening late. I was tending the roses near the gate. Saw her slip in all furtive-like. Didn't see her leave, but the next day Mrs. Ravenscroft seemed out of sorts. Pale, quiet, not herself. Poirot's fingers steepled beneath his chin. And this Dorothea, did she ever speak to you? Once, Henshaw said. Asked me about the cliffs, how steep they were, how far down to the sea. Thought it odd, but I figured she was just curious. Now I wonder. He trailed off, shaking his head. Wonder what? Ariadne prompted. Henshaw's voice dropped to a near whisper. If she was planning something, those cliffs, they're no place for a wanderer. And then she was gone, they said. Fell, they reckoned. Sleepwalking, of all things. Poirot's eyes gleamed with that peculiar intensity that signaled his mind was at work, piecing together fragments others might overlook. Mercy, Monsieur Henshaw, you have been most helpful. May we see the grounds, particularly the path to the cliffs? Celia bit her lip. I know. It's why I never forgot it. She gave me a locket, said it was from her travels in Asia. I still have it. May I see it? Ariadne asked, her curiosity piqued. Celia nodded and left the room, returning moments later with a small silver locket. She opened it to reveal a tiny photograph of a young boy, no older than 5, with Dorothea's sharp features. She said it was her son, Celia whispered. The one who drowned. She cried when she gave it to me. Ariadne's breath caught. Dorothea's son, the child whose death had shattered her, was a piece of the puzzle they hadn't fully explored. Celia, this is important. Did she say anything else about him, or about why she was here? Celia shook her head. Just that. She wanted to make things right. I didn't understand what she meant. Spence, who had been listening silently, spoke up. Make things right. Sounds like guilt, or a confession. Ariadne tucked the locket into her pocket with Celia's permission, her mind whirling. Dorothea's gentleness, her gift to Celia. The shadow on the cliff, none of it fit the narrative of a mad woman wandering to her death. She needed to speak. To Poirot. And soon, that evening, Ariadne sat in the village inn, a cozy place with low beams and a roaring fire. She sipped a glass of sherry, her notebook open to a list of names, guests and staff at the manor during Dorothea's final days. Spence had gone to bed, muttering about the futility of chasing shadows. But Ariadne couldn't rest. She was sketching by a timeline when the innkeeper, a wiry man named Mr. Cobb, approached with a fresh pot of tea. "You're digging into the old Ravenscroft business, aren't you?" he said, his eyes glinting with curiosity. "Heard you talking to Mrs. Tilling." Ariadne smiled, sensing an opportunity. "You've got sharp ears, Mr. Cobb. Were you in Overcliff when Dorothea Jarrow died?" He nodded, setting the teapot down. "I ran this in then, same as now. Folk talked plenty after she fell. Some said it was no accident, that she'd been pushed." Ariadne's pulse quickened. Pushed? By whom? Mr. Cobb leaned closer, his voice low. "No names, mind you. But there was a stranger in the village that week. A man, tall, kept to himself. Stayed right here at the inn. Paid in cash. Left the morning after Dorothea's fall. Never saw him again." "Did you tell the police?" Ariadne asked, echoing her earlier question to Mrs. Tilling. Mr. Cobb chuckled darkly. "Police didn't care for village gossip. They had their stories. Leapwalking. End of discussion. But I saw that man, and he wasn't here for the scenery." Ariadne scribbled furiously, her mind racing. A stranger, a dark coat, a hurried departure. It was another thread, fragile but tantalizing. She thanked Mr. Cobb and returned to her notes, her thoughts spiraling toward a single question. Who had wanted Dorothea Jarrow dead, and why? The next morning, Ariadne drove to a nearby town to telephone Poirot. The manor's ancient phone line too unreliable for a clear connection. She found a quiet booth in a post office, the hum of voices around her fading as she dialed. Poirot answered on the second ring, his voice crisp despite the crackling line. "Mrs. Oliver, you have news?" he asked, a hint of anticipation in his tone. She recounted Mrs. Tilling's story, the locket, and Mr. Cobb's tale of the stranger. Poirot listened without interruption, and when she finished, he let out a soft "Mon Dieu." "This is most intriguing." "What about Zélie?" Ariadne pressed. "Have you found her?" "I have," Poirot said, and she could almost see his moustache twitch with satisfaction. "Mademoiselle Zélie Morat is in Lausanne, living quietly. I have arranged to meet her tomorrow." She was reluctant, but I persuaded her that the truth must be told. Ariadne gripped the receiver. "Do you think she knows what happened to Dorothea?" "I suspect she knows more than she wishes to admit," Poirot replied. "Her departure was too sudden, too convenient, and now, with this shadow, this stranger, I begin to see the shape of a deception. But we must be patient, Mrs. Oliver. The little grey cells, they work, but they require all the pieces." Ariadne smiled despite herself. "You and your little grey cells. What should I do next?" "Return to the manor," Poirot instructed. "Find any record of visitors, that week guest books, letters, anything, and speak to Celia again. Her memory of Dorothea's gentleness may hold a clue we have overlooked." Back at the manor, Ariadne enlisted Celia's help to search the attic. where the Ravenscroft's old papers were stored in crumbling boxes. The air was thick with dust, and the single bulb cast long shadows across the rafters. Celia, her sleeves rolled up, sorted through letters, while Ariadne tackled a guest book from 12 years prior. "Here's something," Celia said, holding up a yellowed envelope. "It's addressed to Aunt Dorothea, but it's not opened." Ariadne took it, her fingers brushing against the brittle paper. The postmark was from London, dated a week before Dorothea's death. She slit it open carefully, revealing a single sheet of paper with a brief, typed message. "Meet me at the cliffs at midnight, the 14th of September. We must settle this. K. K." Ariadne murmured. "Who's K?" Celia frowned, her brow creasing. "I don't know. But that's the night she died." Ariadne's stomach twisted. But the 14th of September, the night Dorothea fell. This wasn't a sleepwalking accident, it was a rendezvous. She tucked the letter into her bag, her mind buzzing with possibilities. Was Kay the stranger Mr. Cobb had seen? The figure in the dark coat, or someone closer, someone within the Ravenscroft's circle? As they descended from the attic, Celia paused on the stairs, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Oliver, do you think my parents knew about Dorothea? I mean, if someone hurt her, would they have covered it up?" Ariadne met her gaze, seeing the fear and hope tangled in her eyes. "I don't know, Celia, but Poirot and I will find out, I promise." That night Ariadne lay awake in her room at the bin, the letter burning a hole in her thoughts. She imagined Dorothea slipping out into the darkness, drawn by a promise or a threat. The cliffs, the sea, the shadow trailing hurt, was a scene straight out of a Gothic novel, yet it felt all too real. She drifted into uneasy dreams, haunted by the image of a woman in white, falling into the abyss. In Lausanne, Poirot was preparing to confront Zélie Morat, a woman whose silence had guarded secrets for 12 years. Ariadne trusted his skill, his relentless pursuit of truth. But she couldn't shake the feeling that they were racing against time. The past was stirring, its shadows lengthening, and somewhere in the tangle of memory and deception lay the answer to Dorothea's death hand. The tragedy that followed. The cliffside enigma was no longer just a question of accident or suicide. It was a puzzle of intent, of hidden players and buried motives, and Ariadne, for all her doubts, was determined to see it through. Chapter 8. Echoes from Asia. The late afternoon sun cast a golden haze over London, its light filtering through the heavy drapes of Hercule Poirot's impeccably ordered drawing-room. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood and the faint musk of old books, a sanctuary of calm amid the city's clamour. Poirot sat in his favourite armchair, a sleek, modern design that contrasted with the ornate Victorian decor. His small hands folded neatly over a leather-bound notebook. Across from him, sprawled with less elegance but equal intensity, was Ariadne Oliver, her scarf askew and a smudge of ink on her cheek from a morning spent scribbling plot ideas. "You know, Poirot," Ariadne said, twirling a stray lock of hair, This Ravenscroft business is like one of my novels, only it's missing half the pages. We've got wigs, a biting dog, and now a twin sister with a shadowy past. It's positively theatrical, but where's the script? Poirot's mustache twitched, a subtle signal of amusement. The script, Madame Oliver, is written in the memories of those who lived it, and memories, like your novels, are often unreliable narrators. We must now turn to the past specifically, to Asia, where the threads of Dorothea Jarrow's life began to unravel. Ariadne leaned forward, her eyes glinting with curiosity. Asia, you mean that tidbit Mr. Goby dropped about Dorothea? Time there. Something about a tragedy with her child. Precisement, Poirot replied, tapping his notebook. Mr. Goby, with his usual efficiency, has provided a dossier on Dorothea Jarrow's years in Malaya and Singapore. It is not a pleasant tale, but it may hold the key to why the Ravenscrofts met their end on that cliffside in Overcliff. He opened the notebook, revealing pages of meticulous handwriting, interspersed with Goby's typed reports. Dorothea Jarrow nee Preston Gray was not always the troubled figure we now suspect. In the early 1940s, she married a naval officer, Captain Lawrence Jarrow, and followed him to Malaya, where he was stationed. There, amidst the humid jungles and colonial outposts, their son, Edward, was born. But tragedy struck in 1945, when Edward, barely 2 years old, drowned in a river near their home. Ariadne gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Drowned. How awful! Was it an accident? Poirot's eyes narrowed. That is the question. Nest C. Pa. The official report called it an accident, but whispers among the expatriate community suggested otherwise. Dorothea was seen as unstable. There were rumors of neglect, perhaps even intent. Mr. Goby's contact servants, neighbors. A missionary nurse paint a picture of a woman spiraling into despair, her mind fraying under the weight of isolation and grief. Ariadne frowned, her writer's imagination already spinning. So, Dorothea's son dies, and she falls apart. But how does that connect to Margaret and Alistair Ravenscroft? They were in England by then, weren't they? Indeed, Poirot said, but the sisters were close, despite the distance. Margaret corresponded regularly with Dorothea, and there are hints she visited Malaya during this period, perhaps to support her twin. We must uncover what passed between them and whether Dorothea's actions in Asia cast a shadow that reached Overcliff years later. Ariadne clapped her hands, a spark of excitement cutting through the grim topic. Right, then, we need to dig into those whispers. Who can we talk to? Someone must still be alive who knew Dorothea in Malaya. Poirot nodded. Mr. Goby has located a key witness, Mrs. Evelyn Pritchard, a former missionary nurse who tended to Dorothea after Edward's death. She now resides in a modest cottage in Kent, retired but sharp of mind. We shall visit her tomorrow. But tonight I must study these reports further. The truth, madame, lies in the details. The next morning, Poirot and Ariadne set out for Kent. In a hired car, the countryside unfolding in a patchwork of green fields and hedgerows, under a sky bruised with rain clouds. Ariadne, never one for silence, filled the journey with theories, each more outlandish than the last. Suppose Dorothea didn't just lose her son, she mused, gripping the steering wheel as they navigated a narrow lane. What if she did something terrible on purpose and Margaret found out? That could explain why Alistair was so protective of Dorothea. Maybe he was covering for her. Poirot, adjusting his hat against the breeze from an open window, gave a small shake of his head. Possible, but we must not leap to conclusions. The human heart is complex, Madame. Guilt, love, and loyalty can twist even the most rational mind. Let us hear what Mrs. Pritchard has to say. The cottage in Kent was a quaint, ivy-covered affair, its garden bursting with late summer roses. Mrs. Evelyn Pritchard, a wiry woman in her late 70s, with piercing blue eyes and a demeanor, greeted them at the door. Her hands, gnarled from years of work, clutched a tray of tea and biscuits as she ushered them into a cozy parlor. "I don't get many visitors asking about Malaya," she said, pouring tea with a steady hand. "But when your Mr. Goby wrote, I knew it was about the Gerrows. Poor Dorothea. That woman carried more sorrow than most could bear." Poirot inclined his head, his voice gentle but probing. "Madame Pritchard, we seek the truth about Dorothea Jarrow and the death of her son, Edward. The official report says he drowned by accident, but there are suggestions of irregularities. What do you recall?" Evelyn's eyes clouded, and she set her teacup down with a clink. It was 1945, just after the war ended. Malaya was a mess. Japanese occupation had left everyone on edge, and the British were scrambling to restore order. I was a nurse at a small mission hospital in Kuala Lumpur. Dorothea came to us after Edward's death, half out of her mind with grief, or so I thought at first. Ariadne leaned forward, her voice soft. "What do you mean, at first?" Evelyn hesitated, her gaze drifting to the window. Dorothea wasn't just grieving. She was haunted. She'd sit for hours, staring at nothing, muttering about the river, about how Edward slipped away. But there were things she said, things. She told me once that she'd been bathing him in the river, holding him under the water to cleanse his soul. I thought it was just delirium, but the servants whispered she'd been drinking heavily that day, and no one saw exactly how Edward drowned. Poirot's fingers steepled, a sign of deep thought. "You suspected she may have caused his death." Evelyn's lips tightened. I didn't want to believe it. Dorothea was fragile, not cruel, but there was a darkness in her. She'd have these fits, screaming, throwing things. Lawrence, her husband, tried to shield her, but he was away often, and she was alone with Edward. After he died, she was sent to a sanatorium for a time. They said it was a breakdown, but I always wondered if there was more to it. Ariadne's eyes widened. Did Margaret, her sister, know about this? "Oh, yes," Evelyn said. Margaret came to Malaya in 46, after Dorothea was released. She stayed for a month, trying to piece her sister back together. They were twins. You seek closer than most. Margaret was the steady one, always cleaning up Dorothea's messes. But I overheard them arguing one night, outside the mission. Margaret was furious, saying something about never forgiving Dorothea for what she'd done. I didn't catch it all, but it wasn't just grief talking. Poirot's gaze sharpened. And what became of Dorothea after this visit? She and Lawrence moved to Singapore, Evelyn replied. He was reassigned there, and they tried to start fresh. But the rumors followed them. People said Dorothea was drinking again, wandering the streets at night, talking to herself. Lawrence died in 48 a heart attack, they said, but some thought it was the strain of living with her. After that, Dorothea returned to England. I lost track of her then. Ariadne glanced at Poirot, her mind racing. So Dorothea's life in Asia was a disaster. Her son's death, her marriage falling apart, her mental state crumbling. And Margaret knew something. Something big enough to cause a rift between them. Poirot nodded slowly. It is possible that Margaret carried this secret for years, a burden that may have led to the tragedy at Overcleve. But we must confirm the details. Madame Pritchard, do you recall anyone else who might have known Dorothea in Singapore? A friend, perhaps, or another servant? Evelyn thought for a moment, then brightened. There was a cook, Arling, who worked for the Jarrows in Singapore. She was loyal, stayed with them through everything. If anyone knew Dorothea's secrets, it'd be her. Last I heard, she'd retired to a village near Penang, but that was years ago. Poirot made a note, his expression unreadable. Mercy, Madame Pritchard, you have been most helpful. We shall pursue this Arling, if she still lives. As they left the cottage, the sky had darkened, and a light rain began to fall. Ariadne pulled her coat tighter, her mind buzzing. Poirot, this is getting deeper by the minute. If Dorothea killed her son accidentally, or not, and Margaret knew, it could explain everything. Maybe Alistair was protecting Dorothea from the truth coming out. Perhaps, Poirot said, stepping carefully around a puddle. But we must consider another possibility. Mistaken identity. Dorothea and Margaret were identical twins. If Dorothea was in Overcliffe before the Ravenscrofts' deaths, could she have been mistaken for her sister? Or did she deliberately impersonate her? Ariadne stopped dead, rain dripping from her hat. You mean Dorothea could have been living as Margaret? That's diabolical. Poirot's eyes gleamed. The human mind, Madame, is capable of great deception, especially when driven by guilt or desperation. We must find Arling. Her testimony may illuminate the shadows of Dorothea's final days in Asia, back in London. Poirot wasted no time. He dispatched Mr. Goby to track down Arling, whose full name, they learned, was Ling Mei Chen. Goby's network, a web of informants spanning continents, located her in a small fishing village near Penang. Now in her 80s, but still tending a modest noodle stall. A transatlantic call was arranged, and by evening Poirot and Ariadne sat in a cramped office at the back of a bookshop, a crackling telephone line connecting them to Malaysia. Ling's voice, frail but clear, came through the receiver. Her English halting but precise. I worked for Mrs. Jarrow many years. She, good lady, but sad. Always sad after little Edward go. Poirot leaned closer, his voice calm but insistent. Madame Ling, we seek the truth about Dorothea Jarrow's time in Singapore. Did she ever speak of her son's death, or of her sister, Margaret Ravenscroft? There was a long pause, filled with the hum of the line. Mrs. Jarrow, she no talk much, but one night she drink too much, cry to me. She say she hold Edward in river, want to make him pure. She say it her fault, but she no mean to hurt him. I think she confuse, not bad. But Mrs. Margaret come, she angry. She'll say, Dorothea must never tell anyone, or it ruin everything. Ariadne's breath caught. So Margaret was protecting her sister's secret. Maybe, Ling said. Mrs. Margaret stay 1 month. She try to fix Mrs. Jarrow, but Mrs. Jarrow get worse. She walk at night, talk to people not there. Once she wear Mrs. Margaret's dress, call herself Margaret. I think she'll want to be her sister to escape. Poirot's eyes narrowed to slits. And after Margaret left, what happened? Mr. Jarrow dies soon after. Mrs. Jarrow go back to England. She'll send me letter once, say she'll live with sister now, but she afraid. She'll say, I am not me any more. I understand. The call ended shortly after, with Ling promising to send any old letters she still had. Ariadne sat back, stunned. Poirot, this is huge. Dorothea was unraveling in Singapore, pretending to be Margaret, and then she goes to Overcliff. It's like she was losing herself piece by piece. Poirot closed his notebook with a snap. Indeed, madame. The line between Dorothea and Margaret blurs. Was Dorothea in Overcliff as herself, or as her sister? And if Alistair knew of her instability, why did he allow her to stay? The answers lie in those final days before the tragedy. That night, as rain lashed the windows of Poirot's flat, he pored over Goby's reports, cross-referencing dates and details. A pattern emerged. Dorothea's return to England coincided with a period when Margaret began wearing wigs, a detail that now seemed less about vanity and more about concealment. Had Margaret been hiding her sister's presence, or her own identity? And the dog's bite, could it have been a reaction to Dorothea, not Margaret? Ariadne, sipping a glass of sherry, broke the silence. You know, Poirot, this feels like one of those Greek myths twins, mistaken identities, a curse that follows the family. Do you think Dorothea meant to harm Margaret? Poirot's gaze was distant, his mind piecing together the puzzle. Intent is the heart of this mystery. Dorothea's actions in Asia suggest a woman tormented by guilt, perhaps incapable of separating reality from delusion. If she impersonated Margaret, it may not have been malice, but a desperate attempt to reclaim a life she believed she'd lost. Yet someone pulled that trigger in Overcliff. We must discover who and why. As the clock struck midnight, Poirot closed his notebook, his expression resolute. The echoes from Asia had revealed a woman broken by loss, a sister bound by loyalty, a tragedy that refused to stay buried. The truth, he knew, was closer, but it would demand every ounce of his little grey cells to unravel. Chapter 9. The Burtoncocks' Motiver. Autumn air hung heavy with the scent of damp leaves as Hercule Poirot sat in his London apartment, the soft glow of a single lamp illuminating the meticulous order of his desk. His fingers, delicate yet purposeful, traced the edge of a dossier Mr. Goby had delivered that morning. The file was thin, but its contents were explosive details about Mrs. Burtoncock's sudden interest in a 12-year-old tragedy. Poirot's grey eyes, sharp despite the weight of years, scanned the pages, his mind weaving threads of motive and deception into a tapestry that was beginning to take shape. Ariadne Oliver, perched on the edge of an armchair, clutched a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Her scarf, a riot of crimson and gold, seemed to mirror the restless energy she exuded. "It's positively ghastly," she declared, her voice cutting through the room's quiet. "That woman Burtoncock's barging into Celia's life like some sort of vulture. Why does she care so much about the Ravenscrofts? It's not as if she knew them." Poirot's moustache twitched, a faint sign of amusement at Ariadne's indignation. "Madame, the question of why is always the heart of the matter. People do not pry into old wounds without reason. And Mrs. Burtoncock's, I suspect, has a reason most compelling." Ariadne leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "You think she's hiding something, don't you? Something juicy." Poirot's tone was dry, but his gaze softened. "Perhaps, but let us say her interest is not altruistic. Mr. Goby's report suggests a connection most intriguing." He tapped the dossier. "Desmond Burtoncock's, her adopted son, stands to inherit a considerable fortune from his biological mother, one Kathleen Fenn, a celebrated actress of the stage. This fortune, however, comes with conditions." Ariadne's brow furrowed. "Conditions? What kind?" Poirot's voice lowered, as if the walls themselves might overhear. "Should Desmond die before the estate is fully transferred, the fortune reverts to Mrs. Burtoncock herself. A sum, I am told, in the millions." The room fell silent, save for the faint tick of a clock on the mantel. Ariadne's jaw dropped. "You mean to say she'd benefit if something happened to him? That's monstrous." "Monstrous, perhaps," Poirot said, "but not impossible. Human nature, Madame Oliver, is often swayed by the glitter of gold. Let us consider. Mrs. Burtoncock asks about the Ravenscrofts' deaths, probing whether it was murder or suicide. Why? Because Celia Ravenscroft, Desmond's fiancée, is tied to that tragedy. If Celia's past is tainted, say, by a hereditary scandal, Mrs. Burtoncock might hope to derail the engagement, thus securing Desmond's fortune for herself." Ariadne set her cup down with a clatter. "That's it, isn't it? She's digging for dirt to break them up. Oh, Poirot, we've got to stop her. Celia's such a dear girl, and Desmond, well, he's smitten. You should see them together, all starry-eyed and planning their future." Poirot raised a hand, his expression calm but commanding. "Patience, madame. We must proceed with care. To accuse without proof is to invite chaos. Let us explore this motive further. Come, we shall pay a visit to Mrs. Burton Cox herself. The Burton Cox residence was a sprawling affair in Kensington, its facade all Georgian elegance with ivy clinging to the brickwork. The interior, however, was a clash of ostentation-gilded mirrors competed with garish modern art, and the air smelled faintly of expensive perfume and desperation. Mrs. Burton Cox greeted them in a drawing-room that seemed designed to intimidate rather than welcome. She was a tall woman, her auburn hair swept into a severe chignon, her eyes glinting with a mix of curiosity and wariness. "Mr. Poirot, Mrs. Oliver," she said, her voice smooth but edged with impatience. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Ariadne opened her mouth, no doubt ready to unleash a torrent of accusations. But Poirot's subtle gesture silenced her. He inclined his head, the picture of courtesy. "Madame Burton Cox, we are here on a matter most delicate. It concerns your inquiry at the literary luncheon regarding the late General and Lady Ravenscroft." Her face tightened, though she maintained her composure. "I see. And what of it?" It was a simple question, prompted by concern for my son's future. Concern. Poirot's tone was mild, but his eyes were piercing, a curious choice of words. "The Ravenscroft's tragedy is 12 years past, yet you seek to unearth it. May I ask why?" Mrs. Burton Cox's fingers tightened around the arm of her chair. "Celia Ravenscroft is engaged to my son. I have a right to know about her family. If there's instability in her bloodline, it could affect Desmond." Ariadne could no longer hold back. "Instability? That's absurd. Celia's a perfectly lovely girl, and you've no business dragging her parents' memory through the mud." Poirot shot Ariadne a warning glance before returning his attention to Mrs. Burton Cox. "Madame, let us be frank. Your interest in Celia's parents suggests a deeper motive, perhaps one tied to the inheritance of your son, Desmond, from his biological mother, Kathleen Fenn." The room seemed to grow colder. Mrs. Burton Cox's lips parted, then closed, her composure faltering for the first time. "I don't know what you mean," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Poirot pressed on, relentless yet polite. "Allow me to clarify. Desmond stands to inherit a fortune, but should he fail to claim it through death or, perhaps, a broken engagement, the funds revert to you. A most convenient arrangement, Nan." Her eyes flashed with something akin to fear. "You're suggesting I'd sabotage my own son's happiness? That's preposterous, is it?" Poirot leaned forward, his voice soft but unyielding. "The human heart, madame, is capable of great sacrifice and great selfishness. If Celia were deemed unsuitable, might you not hope to sway Desmond against her?" Mrs. Burton Cox stood abruptly, her hands trembling. "This conversation is over. I won't be accused in my own home." Ariadne rose as well, her voice fierce. "You can't just dismiss this. You know, we're on to you, and we'll prove it." Poirot, however, remained seated, his calm unshaken. "Madame Burton Cox, one final question. Did you know Kathleen Fenn personally, or perhaps her solicitor, who manages the estate?" The question caught her off guard. She hesitated, then said, "I met her once or twice, years ago. As for her solicitor, I've no need to deal with such people." But her eyes darted to the side, a telltale sign Poirot did not miss. As they left the house, Ariadne was practically vibrating with indignation. "Did you see her face? She's guilty as sin. She's scheming to keep Desmond's money for herself." Poirot's expression was thoughtful. "Perhaps, Madame Oliver, but we must not leap to conclusions. There is more to uncover. The connection to Kathleen Fenn is key. We must learn more about her life and her enemies." The trail led them to a dusty theatrical archive in Soho, where Kathleen Fenn's career was documented in yellowing playbills and grainy photographs. The archivist, a wiry man named Mr. Tuttle with a penchant for gossip, was delighted to assist. "Oh, Kathleen Fenn was a star, no doubt about it," he said, pulling out a scrapbook. "Voice like a nightingale, presence like a queen. But she had her share of troubles, jealous rivals, obsessive fans, and a rather messy divorce." Poirot's interest sharpened. "A divorce? From whom?" "Some producer, Ronald Crane," Tuttle replied. "Nasty business. He claimed she cheated him out of royalties. After they split, she adopted Desmond, wanted a fresh start, I reckon. Left everything to him in her will. But Crane fought it tooth and nail. Didn't win, mind you. But he made her life miserable." Ariadne's eyes widened. "Do you think Crane's still around? Could he be involved?" Tuttle shrugged. "He's alive, last I heard. Runs a small theatre in Brighton. Bit of a recluse now." Poirot nodded, his mind already racing. "And Mrs. Burton Cox, did she ever cross paths with Kathleen Fenn professionally?" Tuttle's brow furrowed. "Not that I recall, but Kathleen knew everyone in the theatre world. It's possible." As they left the archive, Ariadne was buzzing with theories. What if Mrs. Burton Cox was jealous of Kathleen? Or maybe she was in cahoots with this Crane fellow. "Oh, Poirot, this is getting positively Shakespearean." Poirot smiled faintly. "Let us not write a tragedy just yet, madame. We must visit Brighton and speak with Mr. Crane. He may hold a piece of this puzzle." Brighton's seafront was alive, with the cries of gulls and the chatter of tourists, but the theatre where Ronald Crane worked was a faded relic, its marquee peeling and its lobby smelling of mildew. Crane himself was a man in his 60s, his face lined with bitterness, his eyes wary as he met Poirot and Ariadne in his cramped office. "I don't see what Kathleen's will has to do with me now," Crane said, lighting a cigarette with unsteady hands. "She's been dead for years." Poirot's voice was smooth, disarming. "Monsieur Crane, we are interested in Desmond Burton Cox, the boy Kathleen adopted. You contested her will, did you not?" Crane's jaw tightened. "I did. She had no right to cut me out entirely. I helped build her career, you know. But the courts sided with her hand. That boy, did you know Mrs. Burton Cox, Desmond's adoptive mother?" Poirot asked. Crane exhaled a plume of smoke. "Met her a few times. She was a stage manager back then, always sniffing around Kathleen's productions. Ambitious type. When Kathleen adopted Desmond, she offered to take him In said she'd give him a stable home. Kathleen agreed, fool that she was. Ariadne leaned forward. And did Mrs. Burton Cox ever talk about the Ravenscrofts, or their deaths? Crane frowned. The Ravenscrofts? No, never heard her mention them. Why? Poirot's eyes gleamed. A curiosity, nothing more. One final question, monsieur. Do you believe Mrs. Burton Cox was sincere in her desire to raise Desmond? Crane snorted. Sincere? That woman's as sincere as a crocodile's tears. She wanted Desmond because Kathleen's fortune came with him. Mark my words, she's been counting the days till she can get her hands on that money. As they stepped back into the salty air, Ariadne grabbed Poirot's arm. He's right, isn't he? She's been planning this all along, using Desmond, stirring up Celia's past. It's all about the money. Poirot's expression was unreadable. Perhaps, Madame, but there is a shadow here we have not yet seen. Mrs. Burton Cox's motive is clear, but her connection to the Ravenscrofts remains elusive. We must return to Celia and Desmond. They may hold the final clue. Back in London, Poirot and Ariadne met Celia and Desmond at a quiet cafe near Regent's Park. Celia's face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, but she held Desmond's hand tightly. Desmond, a lanky young man with earnest eyes, looked equally shaken. Mrs. Burton Cox has been unbearable, Celia said, her voice trembling. She keeps asking me about my parents, hinting that I might be tainted somehow. It's cruel. Desmond squeezed her hand. I told her to stop, but she won't listen. She's obsessed with this idea that Celia's not good enough for me. It's nonsense. Poirot's gaze softened. Mademoiselle Celia, Monsieur Desmond, you have my word that we will uncover the truth. But tell me, has Mrs. Burton Cox ever mentioned Kathleen Fenn, Desmond's biological mother? Desmond frowned. Not really. She always said Kathleen wears a friend who trusted her to raise me. But lately, she's been nervous. Keeps talking about the will, saying I need to be careful. Ariadne's eyes lit up. Careful? That's suspicious. She's probably worried you'll marry Celia and secure the fortune before she can interfere. Poirot nodded slowly. There is one more avenue to explore. Monsieur Desmond, do you have access to the documents of your mother's estate? A letter, perhaps, or a note from Kathleen herself? Desmond hesitated. There's a box of her things at home. I've never looked through it. Mother always said it was private, but I could check. Do so, Poirot said firmly, and be discreet. If Mrs. Burton Cox is indeed scheming, we must not alert her. That evening, Desmond slipped into the study of the Burton Cox residence, his heart pounding as he opened a locked trunk he'd never dared touch before. Inside were letters, photographs, and a small journal in Kathleen Fenn's elegant handwriting. One entry, dated a year before her death, caught his eye. I've made a terrible mistake trusting M. She's not what she seemed. If anything happens to me, Desmond must know the truth. The Ravenscroft case, she knows more than she admits. I fear she's waiting for her chance. Desmond's hands shook as he read the words. He slipped the journal into his pocket and hurried to meet Poirot and Ariadne at their agreed rendezvous, a small inn on the outskirts of London. Poirot read the entry in silence, his face grave. Bis mis amis is the spark that lights the fuse. Mrs. Burton Cox knew of the Ravenscroft tragedy perhaps even before it occurred. Her question to Madame Oliver was no accident. She seeks to use the past to control the future. Ariadne's voice was hushed. But how did she know? And what does she know? Poirot's eyes gleamed with determination. That, madame, is what we shall discover. The game is afoot, and the truth is within our grasp. The chapter closed with the weight of Kathleen's words hanging in the air, a chilling hint that Mrs. Burton Cox's motives were not only financial but tied to a deeper, darker secret. Poirot's resolve was unshaken, and Ariadne's indignation burned brighter than ever. For Celia and Desmond, the revelation was a beacon of hope and a warning of the danger still lurking in the shadows of the past. Chapter 10. The governess's secret. The train to Lausanne sliced through the Swiss countryside, its rhythm a steady heartbeat against the frost-kissed windows. Hercule Poirot sat in a plush first-class carriage, his gloved hands folded over the put-silver handle of his cane, his eyes fixed on the rolling hills dusted with snow. The Alps loomed in the distance, their peaks sharp as secrets against the pale November sky. He was not a man for idle travel. Every journey had purpose, and this one carried the weight of a 12-year-old mystery. Zélie Morat, the Ravenscroft's former governess, held a key to the tragedy of Overcliff, and Poirot intended to unlock it. Ariadne Oliver had remained in London, chasing her own leads among the elephants of memory-old friends, servants, and neighbors who might recall a fragment of the Ravenscrofts' final days. Poirot, however, preferred the precision of a single critical witness. Zélie, who had fled to Lausanne after the deaths, was no ordinary governess. Her sudden departure, her silence, her absence from the inquest, pointed to a woman who knew more than she had ever told. Poirot's moustache twitched as he considered the possibilities. A secret, yes, but of what nature? Guilt, fear, or something deeper woven into the fabric of the Ravenscroft family. The train slowed as it approached Lausanne, the platform bustling, with fur-clad travellers and porters hauling steamer trunks. Poirot disembarked, his polished shoes clicking on the stone platform. He adjusted his Homburg hat and scanned the crowd. A driver, arranged by Mr. Goby, awaited him with a discreet sign. M. Poirot, the man. A wiry Swiss with a face like weathered granite led him to a sleek black car. Mademoiselle Morat lives near Ouchy, the driver said in accented French. Quiet place. She does not see many visitors. Bon, Poirot replied, settling into the back seat. Then she will be all the more surprised to see me. The drive to Ouchy wound along Lake Geneva, its waters a mirror of steel under the overcast sky. Poirot's mind churned. Zélie had been young when she served the Ravenscrofts, barely 25, tasked with educating Celia and her younger brother Edward. She had been described as efficient, reserved, with a knack for languages and a quiet devotion to the children. Yet, after the tragedy, she had vanished, leaving only a forwarding address in Lausanne. Why, Poirot's little grey cells hummed. A governess did not flee unless she had something to hide, or someone to protect. The car stopped before a modest chalet. Its wooden shutters painted a faded blue. Ivy clung to the stone walls, and a small garden, bare in the late autumn chill, framed the entrance. Poirot thanked the driver and approached the door, his cane tapping a deliberate rhythm. He knocked, and after a moment the door creaked open. Zélie Moerat was no longer the young woman of 12 years ago. Her hair, once a rich chestnut, was streaked with grey, pulled into a severe bun. Her face, lined but still handsome, bore the weight of years and secrets. Her eyes, a startling green, widened at the sight of him. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice low, tinged with a French accent that had softened from years abroad. I did not expect, nor did I expect to find you so easily, mademoiselle," Poirot said, offering a small bow. "May I come in? The matter is one of some delicacy." Zélie hesitated, her hand tightening on the doorframe. Then, with a resigned nod, she stepped aside. "Of course, please." The interior of the chalet was sparse but warm, with a fire crackling in the hearth. A bookshelf lined one wall, filled with volumes in French, English, and German classics, histories, and a few well-worn novels. A single photograph stood on the mantel, a young Celia Ravenscroft, laughing, her hair wind-tossed, clutching a kite. Poirot noted it, but said nothing. Taking the offered chair across from Zélie, "You know why I am here," he began, his tone gentle but firm. "The deaths of Alistair and Margaret Ravenscroft, a tragedy that remains, shall we say, unresolved." Zélie's hands folded in her lap, her fingers twisting the edge of her shawl. "I told the police everything I knew at the time," she said, her voice steady but guarded. "It was a terrible accident, or suicide. I don't know." Poirot tilted his head, his eyes sharp. "Mademoiselle, you were their governess. You lived in their home, shared their meals, taught their children. You saw things others did not. And yet you left England the day after their bodies were found. Why?" Her gaze dropped to the floor. "I had no reason to stay. My employment ended. I wanted to return home." "Home," Poirot repeated, his voice soft as velvet. "And yet you did not return to France. You came here, to Lausanne, to a quiet life where no one would ask questions. That is not the action of a woman with nothing to hide." Zélie's lips parted, but no sound came. She rose abruptly, crossing to the window, where the lake gleamed like a sheet of glass. "You don't understand," she whispered. "It was not my place to speak." "Then make it your place now," Poirot said, his tone unyielding. "Celia Ravenscroft deserves the truth. She is no longer a child, mademoiselle. She is a woman, engaged, seeking answers about her parents' deaths. You owe her that much." Zélie turned, her eyes glistening. "Celia," she murmured. She was such a bright girl, so curious, so brave. I never wanted to hurt her. Then help her now, Poirot urged. Tell me what happened at Overcliff. Tell me about Margaret and Alistair and Dorothea. At the mention of Dorothea, Zélie froze. Her face paled, and for a moment Poirot thought she might faint. She sank back into her chair, her hands trembling. "You know about Dorothea," she said, more a statement than a question. "Oui," Poirot replied. "Margaret's twin sister. A woman with a troubled past incidents in Asia, a child's death time in psychiatric care. She was at Overcliff before the tragedy, was she not? And then, conveniently, she died a month earlier, falling from a cliff while sleepwalking. A curious coincidence." Nun Zelius' breath hitched. "It was no coincidence," she said, her voice barely audible. "But it was not as you think." "Then tell me how it was," Poirot said, leaning forward. "The truth, mademoiselle, all of it." For a long moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Then Zélie spoke, her words slow, as if each one cost her dearly. "It began with Dorothea," she said. "She came to Overcliff, unannounced, 3 weeks before it happened. Margaret was overjoyed at first. They were twins, you see, then sisters, almost one soul in 2 bodies. But Dorothea was not well. She had been in and out of hospitals, her mind fractured. She spoke of things that made no sense, visions, fears, memories that weren't hers. Alistair tried to be patient, but he was worried. For Margaret, for the children. Poirot nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. "And what did you see?" "Mademoiselle, as the governess, you were there, in the heart of the household." Zélie's fingers tightened around her shawl. "I saw the strain. Margaret loved Dorothea, but she was afraid of her. Dorothea would wander the house at night, muttering, sometimes crying. Once I found her in Celia's room, just watching her sleep. I told Alistair, and he promised to handle it, but he did not," Poirot said softly. Zélie shook her head. "No, it got worse. One night I heard shouting from the library. I was upstairs with Edward, but I crept to the landing. It was Dorothea and Margaret arguing. Dorothea was screaming about a promise, something about making it right. I couldn't hear everything, but Margaret was crying, begging her to leave. Then there was a crash. Poirot's eyebrows rose. "Yes," Zélie said, her voice trembling. "I ran downstairs, thinking someone was hurt. I found Margaret on the floor, her head bleeding, a candlestick beside her. Dorothea was standing over her, her hands shaking. She looked at me, and her eyes, they were wild, like an animal's. She said it was an accident. I didn't mean to." Poirot's mind raced. And Alistair, where was he? "He came in moments later," Zélie said. "He saw Margaret, saw the blood, and he broke. He knelt beside her, calling her name, but she was gone. I checked her pulse, nothing. Dorothea was sobbing, saying it was a mistake, that she'd only meant to talk. Alistair told me to take the children to my room and keep them there. He said he would handle everything." Poirot's fingers tapped lightly on his cane. "And you obeyed." I had no choice, Zelly said, her voice cracking. I was young, frightened. I trusted Alistair. He was a general, a man of honor. I took Celia and Edward upstairs, locked the door, and waited. Hours later, Alistair came to me. He said Dorothea had agreed to leave, to disappear, but that we protect the family's name. He told me about the cliff, about staging Dorothea's death to look like an accident. Poirot's eyes narrowed. You mean to say Alistair staged the fall to conceal Margaret's death? Zelly nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. Yes, he said it was the only way. Dorothea was alive, but she was broken. He couldn't bear to see her tried for murder, not when Margaret was already gone. He took her to the cliff that night, made it look like she'd fallen while sleepwalking. He used her coat, her scarf, things that would identify her. The body was too damaged to question. Everyone believed it was Dorothea and Margaret. Poirot pressed, what became of her body? Zelly's voice dropped to a whisper. Alistair buried her. In the woods, near the manor. He said no one could know. He told me to leave for Lausanne, to never speak of it. He gave me money, a letter of reference. I was terrified, Monsieur Poirot. I didn't want to lie, but I couldn't stay. I couldn't face Celia, knowing what I knew. Poirot leaned back, his mind assembling the pieces. And Dorothea, she returned to Overcliff, posing as Margaret. Yes, Zelly said, her voice hollow. Alistair thought it would, by time, keep questions at bay. Dorothea was her twin identical, in every way, except for the dog. That wretched dog knew. It bit her days before the end. It sensed she wasn't Margaret. Poirot's moustache quivered. And the final act, the revolver, the two bodies. Zelly shook her head. I wasn't there. I left the morning after the cliff incident. But I heard later, from the papers, Alistair and Margaret's Dorothea found dead, the revolver between them. I think Alistair couldn't live with it. The guilt, the lies. He protected Dorothea until he couldn't any more. Poirot sat in silence, the weight of her confession settling over him. It was a tale of loyalty and betrayal, of love twisted by madness. Alistair Ravenscroft, the honorable general, had orchestrated a deception to shield his wife's sister, only to be consumed by it. Dorothea, unstable and dangerous, had taken Margaret's place, fooling the world but not the loyal dog. And Zelly, the silent witness, had carried the truth for 12 years. Mademoiselle, Poirot said at last, you have carried a heavy burden, but you have done right to tell me. Celia must know the truth, and you must help me ensure it. Be told. Zelly wiped her eyes. What will happen to me? That, Poirot said, rising, depends on what you choose now. Come with me to London. Speak to Celia. Let the truth set you free. Zelly looked at the photograph of Celia on the mantel, her expression softening. For her, she said, I'll do it for her. As Poirot stepped back into the cold Lausanne air, the lake stretching vast and unyielding before him, he felt the threads of the mystery tightening. The governess's secret had cracked open the case. But the final truth, the revolver, the cliff, the dog still, lay ahead. He would return to London, to Ariadne, to Celia, and together they would unravel the last shadows of Overcliff.